Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Sarah Rodriguez, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote depths of the Angelina National Forest in East Texas, where the pine trees grow so thick they swallow the sky, and the darkness between them seems to pulse with its own malevolent life. I should have listened to my instincts. Should have turned around the moment I saw the way my dog, Ranger, began trembling at the trailhead, his hackles raised like he could smell something rotten on the wind. But I was running from my own ghosts then, and the wilderness seemed like the only place left where I could find silence. 3 months earlier, my younger sister Emma had disappeared from her apartment in Houston. No signs of struggle, no note, just an empty space where a person used to be. The police had given up after 6 weeks. Adults have the right to disappear, they said, as if those words could fill the Emma-shaped hole in my chest. I knew better. Emma wouldn't just leave. Not without telling me. We'd been each other's anchors since our parents died in that car crash when I was 19. So I'd taken a leave from my job as a graphic designer and driven 4 hours east to lose myself in the piney woods, hoping the hiking trails would exhaust me enough to sleep without dreaming of Emma's laugh. Ranger, a 70-pound German Shepherd mix I'd rescued 2 years ago, was my only companion. He'd been Emma's favorite. She always joked that he loved her more than me. The Sawmill Trail was supposed to be a moderate 5-mile loop through some of the forest's most remote sections. I'd hiked it twice before, but never this late in October, when the autumn air carried a sharp bite and the days grew short with alarming speed. The forecast called for clear skies, but the canopy was so dense that even at noon, the trail felt shrouded in perpetual twilight. I parked at the nearly empty trailhead around 2 p.m., figuring I'd have plenty of daylight to complete the loop. The only other vehicle was a rusted pickup truck with Louisiana plates, its bed filled with camping gear and what looked like hunting equipment. A handwritten note tucked under my windshield wiper read, "Nice day for a hike. Fellow nature lover." The handwriting was shaky, almost childlike. Ranger kept looking back toward the truck as we set off, whining softly. "It's okay, boy," I murmured, scratching behind his ears. "Just another hiker." The first mile passed uneventfully. The trail was well marked, winding through towering loblolly pines and hardwood bottoms where the fallen leaves crunched satisfyingly underfoot. But as we moved deeper into the forest, I began to notice things that made my skin prickle with unease. The first was the silence. East Texas forests are never truly quiet. There should have been bird calls, the rustle of squirrels, the distant drumming of woodpeckers. Instead, the only sounds were our footsteps and the whisper of wind through pine needles. Even that seemed muted, as if the trees were absorbing sound rather than carrying it. Then there were the markings. About 2 miles in, I started seeing symbols carved into tree trunks. Not the usual initials and dates left by casual hikers, but strange geometric patterns that looked almost like letters from an alphabet I didn't recognize. They were fresh, the bark still weeping sap around the cuts. Ranger began acting more agitated as we passed each marked tree, pressing close to my legs and occasionally letting out low growls that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his throat. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that people carved all sorts of nonsense into trees. But the symbols felt deliberate, almost like warnings. The trail split ahead, and I consulted my GPS to confirm we should take the left fork. The device showed our location as a blank green void. No trails, no landmarks, nothing but an empty space where the map should have been. I shook it, checked the battery, even restarted the app, but the screen remained stubbornly vacant. "Weird," I muttered, pulling out the paper map I'd grabbed from the ranger station. But when I unfolded it, the ink seemed to have run together in strange patterns, leaving only illegible smears across what should have been clearly marked trails. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. I looked around, trying to orient myself by the sun, but the canopy was too thick. The light filtering down was gray and directionless, offering no clues about which way was north. Ranger was panting now, despite the cool air, and his eyes kept darting to the trees around us as if tracking movement I couldn't see. I decided to trust my memory and took the left fork, telling myself that I'd hiked this trail before and could find my way by landmarks. But the landmarks weren't where they should have been. The wooden bridge that should have crossed Striker Creek after the fork was gone, leaving only rotting posts jutting from the muddy banks. The creek itself looked different, darker, with an oily sheen on the surface and a smell like wet pennies. Ranger refused to drink from it, backing away when I tried to lead him to the water's edge. I checked my watch, 4:30 p.m. We'd been hiking for 2.5 hours, but it felt like much longer. The light was fading faster than it should have been, and shadows were stretching between the trees like grasping fingers. "Come on, boy," I said, trying to inject confidence into my voice. "Let's pick up the pace." But as we continued deeper into the forest, the wrongness only intensified. The trees themselves seemed different, taller, more twisted, their branches reaching across the trail like a cathedral of bone. Some of the trunks were scarred with deep gouges, as if something with massive claws had marked its territory. Then I heard the crying. It started as a faint sound, almost lost in the wind. A child's voice, sobbing somewhere in the darkness between the trees. Ranger's ears pricked forward, and he looked toward the sound with an expression I'd never seen before. Not curiosity or concern, but something approaching terror. "Hello," I called out. "Is someone there? Do you need help?" The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like a physical weight pressing down on us. Then, after what felt like an eternity, a small voice answered from somewhere to our left. "I'm lost," it said. "I can't find my mommy." Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to keep walking, to ignore the voice and get out of these woods as fast as possible. But the rational part of my mind, the part that remembered how to be human, wouldn't let me abandon a lost child. "Where are you?" I called. "I can help you find her." "I'm here," the voice said, and I realized it was coming from a different direction now, somewhere behind us. "I'm cold." Ranger was growling continuously now, a low rumble that I felt more than heard. His hackles were fully raised and he kept backing away from the direction of the voice, but I pushed through the undergrowth following the sound. "Keep talking," I said. "I'm coming." "I'm so scared," the voice whimpered, and my heart clenched. "There are things in the dark." I broke through a tangle of briars into a small clearing, my phone's flashlight cutting through the gathering gloom. But the clearing was empty except for a pile of what looked like discarded clothes in the center. As I approached, I realized they weren't clothes at all, but the molted skin of something large and unidentifiable, translucent and still wet with some kind of mucus. The crying had stopped again, but now I could hear breathing. Slow, deep breaths coming from the trees around the clearing. Not the breathing of a child, but something much larger, something that was trying very hard to sound human. "Sarah," the voice called, and my blood turned to ice. It knew my name. Worse, it was using Emma's voice now, my sister's exact intonation and accent. "Sarah, help me. I'm stuck." I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam shaking as it swept across the clearing. Ranger was at my heels, pressing against my legs so hard I nearly fell. "Emma?" I whispered, even though I knew it couldn't be her. Knew that whatever was speaking had never been human at all. "I found you," the voice said, and now it was coming from directly above me. "I've been looking everywhere." I looked up into the canopy and saw pale eyes reflecting my flashlight beam, too large and too round to belong to any animal I knew. They blinked slowly, and when they opened again, they were gone. I ran. Branches tore at my clothes and face as I crashed through the undergrowth, Ranger keeping pace beside me. Behind us, I could hear laughter, Emma's laughter, but wrong somehow, pitched too high and lasting too long. It echoed off the trees, seeming to come from everywhere at once. I burst back onto what I hoped was the trail, gasping and disoriented. My watch read 6:15 p.m., but the forest around us was dark as midnight. I fumbled for my flashlight, its beam revealing the familiar worn path beneath our feet. But something was wrong with the trail itself. It was too wide now, and the packed earth looked freshly disturbed, as if it had been dug up and hastily replaced. Worse, there were tracks in the soft soil, human footprints that were too large and had too many toes. Ranger suddenly bolted ahead, barking frantically. I followed his beam of light and saw why. There, sitting on a fallen log about 50 feet ahead, was a figure in hiking clothes. A woman with long dark hair, her back to us. "Excuse me," I called, relief flooding through me. "Have you seen?" The figure turned around, and I stumbled backward so hard I nearly fell. It was Emma, or something wearing Emma's face. The features were perfect, down to the small scar on her left eyebrow from when she'd fallen off her bike as a kid. But the expression was all wrong. A slack-jawed grin that stretched too wide, eyes that didn't quite focus on anything. "Hi, sis," it said in Emma's voice. "I've been waiting for you." I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but stand there staring. But my body wouldn't obey me. This thing looked so much like Emma that for a moment my desperate hope overrode my terror. "Emma?" I whispered. "What happened to you? Where have you been?" "I've been here," it said, standing up with movements that were just slightly off, like a marionette controlled by someone still learning how strings worked. "I've been waiting in the trees. There are others here, too. They're hungry." That broke the spell. I grabbed Ranger's collar and pulled him away from the thing backing down the trail. But it followed us, matching our pace perfectly, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Don't go," it said. "We can be together now, forever and ever." I turned and ran again, dragging Ranger with me. The thing's laughter followed us, but after a few minutes the sound faded into the darkness behind us. We ran for what felt like hours, the trail twisting and branching in ways I didn't remember. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but terror kept me moving. Every shadow could be hiding another one of those things. Every sound could be footsteps gaining on us. Finally, I couldn't run anymore. I collapsed against a massive pine tree, gasping and shaking. Ranger pressed close to me, his warm body the only real thing in a world that had suddenly become a nightmare. I checked my watch. 8:45 p.m. We'd been lost in these woods for almost 7 hours, but it felt like days. My phone had no signal, and the battery was dying. The temperature was dropping fast, and I could see my breath misting in the flashlight beam. That's when I noticed the smell. It started as a faint sweetness on the air, like overripe fruit. But as it grew stronger, I realized it was the smell of decay. Meat left too long in the sun, flowers rotting in standing water. The stench was so thick I could taste it on my tongue, making my stomach churn. Ranger began whimpering, pressing his nose into my jacket as if trying to block out the smell. I stood up slowly, sweeping my flashlight beam across the trees around us. The light caught something pale hanging from a low branch about 20 feet away. At first, I thought it was just a piece of fabric caught in the wind, but as I watched, it moved with too much purpose, swaying back and forth like a pendulum. I took a few steps closer, my light revealing more details I wish I'd never seen. It was a sleeping bag, suspended from the branch by what looked like climbing rope. But it was hanging wrong, bulging in places where a sleeping bag should be flat, and it was moving from the inside, as if something was trying to get out, or trying to get in. The zipper was open just a crack, and through the gap I could see something that made my vision blur at the edges. Pale flesh, but not human flesh. Something with too many joints, too many angles, folded in on itself like origami made of bone and sinew. As I watched in horror, a hand pushed through the opening. But it wasn't quite a hand. The fingers were too long, the joints bent in the wrong directions. It groped blindly in the air for a moment before finding the zipper and slowly, deliberately, pulling it wider. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, could only watch as something that had never been human pulled itself out of the sleeping bag and dropped to the forest floor with a wet, meaty sound. It stood about 6 feet tall but hunched over, its limbs too long for its body. Its skin was the color of old mushrooms, translucent enough that I could see dark veins pulsing beneath the surface. Where its face should have been was a smooth expanse of flesh broken only by 2 small holes that might have been nostrils. But the worst part was the way it moved. It walked on all fours, but its joints bent the wrong way, giving it a spider-like gait that was hypnotic and horrible. It moved with purpose, following some scent trail that led directly toward us. Ranger broke first, bolting away from the tree with a yelp of pure terror. The thing's head snapped toward the sound, and though it had no visible eyes, I felt its attention focus on us with laser intensity. I ran after my dog, crashing through the undergrowth as branches tore at my clothes and face. Behind me, I could hear the thing pursuing us. Not the sound of footsteps, but a wet, sliding noise, like something massive dragging itself across the ground. The darkness between the trees seemed to press in on us from all sides, and my flashlight beam only made it worse, creating dancing shadows that could have been hiding anything. Every few seconds, I thought I caught glimpses of pale movement in my peripheral vision, as if more of those things were keeping pace with us just outside the light. Ranger suddenly stopped dead in front of me, his body rigid with fear. I nearly tripped over him, and when I looked up, I saw why he'd frozen. We'd come to the edge of another clearing, this one much larger than the first. But this wasn't empty. The entire space was filled with sleeping bags, dozens of them, hanging from the trees like some grotesque art installation. And every single one was moving. The sounds coming from inside the bags were indescribable. Wet, organic noises that might have been breathing or feeding or something worse. Some of the bags were torn open, revealing glimpses of the pale, wrong things inside. Others bulged and contracted rhythmically, as if whatever was in them was growing. And at the center of the clearing, sitting cross-legged on the ground like she was at a campfire, was Emma, or the thing that looked like Emma. She was smiling, that horrible, too wide smile, and when she saw me, she waved. "You made it," she called out in my sister's voice. "I was starting to worry you wouldn't find us." "What is this place?" I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was talking to her or to myself. "Home," she said simply. "They've been here for so long, Sarah. Longer than the trees. Longer than anything. But they were lonely. They needed family." One of the sleeping bags nearest to her bulged outward, and something pushed through the fabric. A hand that was almost human, but with too many fingers. The thing inside was trying to unzip the bag from within, but its movements were clumsy, like it was still learning how to use its new appendages. "They take what they need," Emma continued, her voice taking on a sing-song quality that made my skin crawl. "Memories, faces, love. They're very good at love, Sarah. They'll love you forever." "You're not Emma," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Emma would never." "Wouldn't I?" The thing interrupted, and for a moment its voice was perfectly Emma's. Confused, hurt, the tone she'd used as a child when I accused her of breaking something. "Don't you want to stay with me? Don't you love me anymore?" The question hit me like a physical blow, because the truth was, I did love Emma. More than anything in the world. And this thing, whatever it was, looked so much like her that it hurt to look at it. But Ranger growled low in his throat and the sound snapped me back to reality. Whatever was wearing my sister's face, it wasn't her. Emma was gone. Had been gone for months. And I was going to join her if I didn't get out of here. "I'm sorry," I whispered, and I meant it. Then I turned and ran. The thing that looked like Emma screamed. A sound that started as my sister's voice but became something else entirely, something that no human throat could produce. The sleeping bags around the clearing began thrashing violently, and I could hear wet, tearing sounds as their occupants fought to free themselves. I crashed through the forest with Ranger at my side, no longer caring about the trail or directions. I just needed to get away from that clearing, away from those things. away from the horrible parody of my sister's face. But the forest seemed to be working against us. Branches that should have been shoulder-high whipped across my face. Roots that hadn't been there a moment before sent me sprawling. The darkness pressed in from all sides, and my flashlight beam grew weaker as the battery died. Then, impossibly, I saw light ahead. Real light, electric and steady. I burst through the trees and found myself back at the parking lot, my car sitting exactly where I'd left it. The sight was so normal, so wonderfully mundane that I nearly cried with relief. But as I fumbled for my keys, I noticed that the rusted pickup truck was gone. In its place was a small pile of what looked like discarded hiking gear, boots, a backpack, clothes that might have belonged to a fellow nature lover who'd left a note on my windshield. I didn't stop to examine it more closely. I unlocked my car, shoved Ranger into the passenger seat, and drove away from that place as fast as the winding forest roads would allow. I didn't stop driving until I reached Houston 3 hours later. I went straight to my apartment, locked every door and window, and sat in my living room until the sun came up. Ranger wouldn't leave my side, and every few minutes he'd walk to the window and stare out at the street as if watching for something. It took me 2 days to work up the courage to call the park rangers. I told them about the sleeping bags in the clearing, about the strange markings on the trees. They listened politely and promised to investigate. But when they called back a week later, they said they hadn't found anything unusual. The sawmill trail was exactly as it had always been, a peaceful 5-mile loop through some of East Texas's most beautiful forest. But they did find something else. A missing persons report that matched the description of the pickup truck's owner, a man from Louisiana who'd been hiking alone and never returned home. They found his vehicle abandoned at a rest stop 50 miles away, with no sign of what had happened to him. I never told them about Emma, about the thing that wore her face and spoke with her voice. How could I? They'd think I was having a breakdown, seeing my missing sister in the woods because I couldn't accept that she was gone. Maybe they'd be right. Maybe grief and exhaustion and the darkness of those woods had combined to create hallucinations that felt more real than reality. Maybe Emma really had just decided to disappear, and the rest was just my mind trying to make sense of a senseless loss. But I know what I saw, and I know that Emma is still out there, in some form, in those woods, waiting for other hikers, other families, other people who love someone enough to follow their voice into the darkness. I never hike alone anymore, never venture into wilderness areas without telling multiple people exactly where I'm going and when I'll be back. And I never, ever go hiking after sunset. Because I know now that there are things in the darkness that have been waiting longer than we can imagine. Things that are very good at love and very hungry for it. Things that take what they need and leave behind perfect copies that are just wrong enough to drive you mad. Emma's apartment is still exactly as she left it. The police released it back to me after their investigation ended, and I've kept paying the rent ever since. Sometimes I go there and sit in her living room, looking through her things, trying to remember what she was really like before that thing in the woods stole her face. But lately, I've been having dreams. Dreams where Emma comes home, where she knocks on her apartment door and asks why I never visit anymore. In the dreams, she looks exactly like she always did. Perfect down to the last detail. In the dreams, I always let her in. Last week, I found a note slipped under my apartment door. It was written in Emma's handwriting, or something very close to it. All it said was, "I miss you. Come visit soon. Love, Emma." I burned the note immediately, but I kept the ashes, just in case. Because the truth is, I miss her too. Miss her so much that sometimes I think about driving back to those woods, about walking the sawmill trail one more time, about letting the darkness swallow me whole if it means I get to see my sister again. Ranger won't let me, though. He sits by the door whenever I pick up my car keys, his eyes fixed on my face with an expression that seems almost human, almost like he knows exactly what I'm thinking and won't let me make that mistake. "Good boy," I tell him. "Good boy." But sometimes, late at night when the shadows in my apartment seem too deep and too dark, I hear crying coming from outside my window. A child's voice, lost and scared, or Emma's voice calling my name. And sometimes, just sometimes, I want to answer. The doctors say the scratches on my arms and face have healed nicely, barely leaving scars. They say the nightmares will fade with time, that trauma has a way of distorting memories until we can't tell what was real and what wasn't. They're probably right. The human mind isn't designed to process experiences like the one I had in those woods. It makes sense that my brain would create explanations that feel real even when they can't be. But I know what I know. And I know that somewhere in the Angelina National Forest, in the darkness between the trees, there are sleeping bags hanging like cocoons. There are things that wear familiar faces and speak with beloved voices. There are creatures that have been waiting in the dark since before humans learned to make fire, patient and hungry and very, very good at love. And I know that Emma is still out there, in some form, adding her voice to their chorus, helping them call other lost souls into the darkness. The note I found under my door wasn't the only one. They come regularly now, always in Emma's handwriting, always with the same message. Come visit. I miss you. Come home. I burn them all, but I read them first. Every single one. Because part of me, the part that loved Emma more than life itself, wants to go back, wants to walk into those woods and let whatever's waiting there take me too. At least then we'd be together. At least then, the Emma-shaped hole in my chest would finally be filled. But Ranger won't let me. And somewhere, in the part of my mind that still remembers how to be human, I know he's right. The things in the darkness are very good at love. But what they offer isn't love at all. It's hunger, wearing love's face. And I've already lost too much to feed their appetite. So I stay in the light. I lock my doors. I keep my phone charged and my gas tank full. And when the dreams come, when Emma knocks on my door with that too-wide smile and asks why I never visit, I remind myself that she's gone. The real Emma is gone. What's left in those woods isn't her, it just knows how to pretend. But sometimes, in the space between sleeping and waking, I forget. And in those moments, I reach for my car keys and think about taking one last hike. Ranger always stops me, though. Good boy. Good boy. My name is Sarah Rodriguez, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the summer of 2023, deep in the East Texas wilderness of the Davy Crockett National Forest, where the towering loblolly pines create a canopy so thick that noon feels like dusk. I should have listened to the park ranger who warned us about the Nesh's Bluff Trail. His weathered face had gone pale when Marcus mentioned our planned route, and he'd stammered something about people going in but not coming out the same. We laughed it off. We were young, we were experienced hikers, and we thought we knew better. There were 4 of us: myself, Marcus Chen, my boyfriend of 2 years and the one who'd organized this trip, Elena Vasquez, my college roommate and closest friend, and Jake Morrison, Marcus's co-worker from the engineering firm. We'd been planning this weekend getaway for months, desperate to escape the suffocating heat and stress of Houston. The forecast promised cooler temperatures under the forest canopy, and we'd reserved a backcountry campsite 15 miles from the nearest road. The drive to the trailhead took us through small East Texas towns where the Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds from ancient oaks, and roadside crosses marked spots where the forest had claimed its due. Marcus drove his Jeep while Jake rode shotgun, constantly fiddling with his GPS unit and complaining about the weak signal. Elena and I sat in the back, windows down, breathing in the humid air that smelled of pine sap and something else, something organic and slightly sweet, like flowers left too long in water. "You sure this is the right way?" Jake asked for the 3rd time, his sandy hair damp with sweat despite the air conditioning. He was the anxious type, always needing reassurance, always checking and double-checking everything. It made him good at his job, but exhausting on trips like this. "GPS says we're on track," Marcus replied, though I noticed his knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Should be another 10 minutes to the parking area. Elena squeezed my hand and grinned. She was the opposite of Jake, spontaneous, fearless, the kind of person who'd jump off a cliff if it looked fun. Her dark eyes sparkled with excitement. "This is going to be amazing," she whispered. "Just the four of us. No cell service, no distractions. Pure nature. If only we'd known what kind of nature was waiting for us." The parking area was nothing more than a dirt clearing beside an overgrown access road. A single weathered sign marked the trailhead: Nesh's Bluff Trail, 12 miles to overlook, backcountry camping permitted. Below that, someone had carved words into the wood with a knife. "Turn back now." Fresh scratches, too recent to be the work of time and weather. "Welcoming," Jake muttered, hefting his pack. It was loaded with enough gear to survive a week in the wilderness. The man brought 3 different water purification methods on day hikes. "Probably just some kids trying to scare people," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. He checked his GPS one more time before we started walking. The device showed our location as a blue dot in a sea of green, but even I could see the topographical lines were fuzzy, indistinct. The trail began innocuously enough, a well-maintained path through mixed hardwood forest. Shafts of golden sunlight filtered through the canopy, and the air hummed with insects. Elena walked ahead of us, her red backpack a bright spot against the green backdrop. She hummed as she walked, some tune I didn't recognize, and birds seemed to answer her from the trees. For the first hour, everything was perfect. We crossed several small creeks on fallen logs, stopped to photograph a family of deer, and made good time despite the rising humidity. Marcus had his camera out constantly, documenting our adventure. He was proud of his photography, always talking about composition and lighting. I loved watching him work, the way he'd crouch low or climb high to get the perfect shot. It was Jake who first noticed something was wrong. "Hey," he called from the rear of our group. "Does anyone else hear that?" We stopped and listened. The normal forest sounds had faded. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals. Even the insects had gone quiet. The silence pressed against my eardrums like water. "Probably scared them off walking past," Elena said, but she wasn't humming anymore. We continued deeper into the forest. The path began to slope downward, following the contours of the land toward the Neches River Valley. The trees grew larger, older, their massive trunks scarred by decades of storms and floods. Spanish moss hung in thick curtains from the branches, and the air grew cooler, damper. That's when the GPS started acting up. "This can't be right," Marcus said, stopping abruptly. He held the device at arm's length, rotating it slowly. "It says we've been walking in circles." Jake crowded over his shoulder, his face pale. "That's impossible. We've been following the trail the whole time." I looked back the way we'd come. The path stretched straight behind us, clearly visible between the trees. No circles, no confusion, just a simple trail heading north into the forest. "Maybe it's the canopy," I suggested. "Tree cover can mess with satellite signals." Marcus tried resetting the unit, but the blue dot kept jumping around the screen like a drunken firefly. Finally, he turned it off in frustration. "We'll navigate the old-fashioned way," he said, pulling out a paper map and compass. "Good thing Jake made us bring these." The map showed the trail as a dotted red line, but when Marcus tried to orient it with the compass, the needle spun wildly, never settling on magnetic north. We tried moving to different spots, thinking there might be metal deposits in the soil, but the compass continued its erratic dance. "Equipment failure," Jake said, but his voice shook. "It happens. We should turn back." "We've come 6 miles already," Elena protested. "The campsite is only 3 more miles. We can find our way that far." I wanted to side with Jake, wanted to suggest we head back to the safety of the parking area, but I also didn't want to ruin everyone's weekend. We'd all taken time off work, driven 4 hours from Houston, and planned this trip for months. Besides, the trail was clearly marked. How hard could it be to follow? So we pressed on. deeper into the forest. The trees continued to grow larger and more ancient as we descended toward the river valley. Some of the pines were easily 4 feet in diameter, their bark deeply furrowed and dark with age. Vines and air plants created a green web between them, and the canopy had thickened until only scattered patches of sky were visible overhead. The silence was what bothered me most. In a healthy forest, there should have been constant sound: birds, insects, the rustle of small mammals. But here, the only noise was our own footsteps on the packed earth and the occasional crack of a branch somewhere in the distance. "Look at this," Elena called from ahead. She'd stopped beside a massive pine tree, its trunk split by some ancient lightning strike. The hollow was large enough for a person to stand inside, and the wood had been burned black by the electrical discharge. Marcus immediately started photographing the tree from different angles. "This has to be centuries old," he said. "Maybe older. Can you imagine the storms this thing has weathered?" That's when we heard the first whisper. It was so faint I almost missed it, like wind through leaves. But there was no wind. The air hung still and heavy around us. The sound came again, a sibilant murmur that seemed to emanate from the burned tree itself. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked. "Hear what?" Jake was already backing away from the tree, his hand on his pepper spray. "Probably just wood settling," Marcus said, but he lowered his camera and took a step back too. Elena laughed, but it sounded forced. "You're all paranoid. It's just the forest. Trees make noise all the time." She reached out to touch the charred bark inside the hollow, and that's when the whispering became unmistakable. Multiple voices, layered and overlapping, speaking words I couldn't understand. They rose and fell like water flowing over stones, beautiful and terrible at the same time. Elena yanked her hand back as if burned. "Okay, that's definitely not normal." We left the tree quickly and continued down the trail, but the whispers followed us. They seemed to come from the canopy overhead, carried on air currents that didn't exist. Sometimes they sounded like children singing lullabies. Sometimes they sounded like screaming. The trail began to wind more frequently, switchbacking down the steep slope toward the river. The vegetation grew denser, more tropical, fed by the moisture rising from the water below. Palmettos spread their fan-shaped leaves beneath the pines, and massive cypress trees emerged from hidden swamps. It was nearly 4 o'clock when we reached what should have been our campsite. The GPS coordinates matched according to Marcus's last reading before the device failed completely. The area looked right too, a small clearing beside a clear stream, with fire rings from previous campers and several flat spots suitable for tents. But something was wrong with the place. The fire rings were wrong. Instead of the typical circle of stones, these were arranged in complex patterns, spirals and crescents and shapes that hurt to look at directly. The stones themselves were stained dark with something that wasn't ash, and they gave off a smell like copper pennies and old flowers. "Previous campers were creative," Elena said, but she made no move to set down her pack. Jake was already pulling out his satellite communicator, an emergency device that could send text messages via satellite. "No signal," he announced, shaking the device. "This thing should work anywhere on the planet." "Let's just set up camp," Marcus said. "We're all tired and it'll be dark soon. We can figure out the communication issues tomorrow." But when we tried to set up our tents, we discovered another problem. The ground that had looked perfectly flat from a distance was actually uneven, dotted with small mounds and depressions that made it impossible to find level spots. Every time we thought we'd found a good place to pitch a tent, closer inspection revealed roots, rocks, or soft spots that would collapse under weight. "It's like the forest doesn't want us here," Jake muttered, now openly talking about leaving. Elena finally found a relatively flat area near the stream, but when she tried to drive the first tent stake into the ground, it hit something solid just beneath the surface. She cleared away the leaves and dirt, revealing white stone carved with symbols that looked almost like letters, but not quite. "Is that a grave marker?" Marcus asked, kneeling beside her. The stone was about the size of a dinner plate, worn smooth by weather and time. The symbols carved into its surface were deep and deliberate, but they didn't match any alphabet I knew. Around the edges, someone had carved a circle of smaller symbols that looked like eyes. "There's another one," I said, pointing to a similar mound a few feet away. And another. Soon, we realized we were standing in the middle of a cemetery, or what had once been a cemetery. Dozens of the white stones dotted the clearing, some partially buried, others broken and scattered. But the arrangement was wrong. Instead of neat rows facing east like a proper Christian burial ground, these graves formed the same complex patterns we'd seen in the fire rings. "We can't camp here," Jake said. "This is consecrated ground. It's not right." "It's probably an old Indian burial ground," Marcus said, but even he looked uncomfortable. "They're all over East Texas. We'll be respectful." Elena had gone quiet, staring at one of the stones near the stream. When I approached her, I saw why. This marker was larger than the others, and the symbols carved into it were still sharp and clear despite obvious age. But it was the date that made my blood run cold. August 15th, 2023. That was tomorrow. "This can't be right," I said, kneeling beside the stone. "This has to be some kind of mistake." But the carving was deep and weathered, clearly old, and below the date, carved in letters I could read, was a single name, Elena. "What is it?" Elena asked, joining me beside the stone. I pointed to the carving. Elena stared at it for a long moment, her face going pale. Then she laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that echoed off the trees. "Someone's playing a joke," she said. "Has to be." "Jake, did you set this up?" Jake backed away, his hands raised. "I swear I didn't. I've never been here before in my life." Marcus knelt beside the stone and ran his fingers over the carved letters. "This is old," he said quietly. "Really old. The weathering patterns, the lichen growth. This has been here for decades at least." "That's impossible," Elena said, but her voice lacked conviction. The sun was setting behind the canopy and the temperature was dropping rapidly. We needed shelter for the night, cemetery or no cemetery. With growing unease, we pitched our tents as far from the grave markers as possible, near the edge of the clearing where the ground was marginally more level. As we worked, the whispers grew stronger. They seemed to come from the stones themselves now, rising and falling with the rhythm of breathing. Sometimes I could almost make out words, names, warnings, pleas for help. But when I tried to focus on them, they dissolved into meaningless sound. Marcus got a fire started in one of the existing rings, carefully moving aside the stained stones and replacing them with clean ones from the stream. The flames burned normally at first, casting dancing shadows across our small camp. But as full darkness fell, the fire began to change. The flames took on a blue-green tinge, like burning copper. They hissed and sputtered, and smoke rose in patterns that defied the wind. Worse, the fire seemed to cast shadows in the wrong directions, dark shapes that moved independently of their sources. "Mineral deposits in the wood," Marcus said, but he moved his sleeping bag farther from the fire. We ate a cold dinner of trail mix and energy bars, none of us willing to cook food over the strangely colored flames. As we ate, the whispers grew more insistent, more urgent. They seemed to be trying to tell us something, but the meaning remained just beyond comprehension. "I think we should take shifts keeping watch," Jake suggested. "Just in case." "In case of what?" Elena asked. "Bears? Coyotes?" "I don't know," Jake admitted, "but something's not right here. You can feel it." He was right. The wrongness was almost physical now, like pressure in my ears or the sensation of being watched. The darkness beyond our firelight seemed thicker than it should be, more solid. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turned to look, nothing was there. We agreed to take 2-hour shifts. Marcus volunteered for first watch, so the rest of us crawled into our tents. Elena and I shared a 2-person shelter, while Jake had his own single tent across the fire from us. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the sounds of the forest, except there weren't any. The silence was complete, oppressive. Even the whispers had stopped. I could hear Elena breathing beside me, could hear Marcus moving around outside, but beyond that, nothing. No insects, no night birds, no rustle of wind through leaves. Just silence, pressing down on us like a physical weight. I must have dozed despite my anxiety because I was awakened by Elena shaking me gently. "Sarah," she whispered. "Sarah, wake up." I opened my eyes to find her sitting upright in her sleeping bag, staring at the tent wall. "What is it?" I asked. "Listen." I held my breath and listened. At first, I heard nothing. Then, gradually, I became aware of a new sound. Breathing. Slow, deep breaths that definitely weren't coming from any of us. They seemed to circle our tent, moving from one side to the other with deliberate care. "Is someone out there?" I whispered. Elena shook her head. "I don't know. It's been going on for 10 minutes. The breathing continued its circuit around our tent. Whatever was making the sound was large. The breaths were deep and measured, like those of a sleeping giant. But there was something wrong with the rhythm. The exhales were too long, too controlled. No living thing breathed like that. I reached for the tent zipper, but Elena grabbed my wrist. "Don't," she whispered. "Whatever's out there, I don't think we want to see it." The breathing stopped. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then, slowly, deliberately, something began to scratch at the side of our tent. Long, scraping sounds like fingernails on fabric. The noise moved methodically from bottom to top, then started again at a different spot. "Marcus," I called softly. "Marcus, are you out there?" No answer. The scratching stopped. We waited, holding our breath, straining to hear any sound that might tell us what was happening outside. Then, from Jake's tent across the fire, came a muffled scream. I unzipped the tent flap and stuck my head out. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting barely enough light to see. Jake's tent was a dark silhouette against the trees, and it was moving, shaking violently as if something large was inside with him. "Jake!" I shouted. The movement stopped instantly. For a moment, everything was still. Then Jake's voice came from inside the tent, calm and conversational. "Everything's fine. Just had a bad dream. Go back to sleep." But it wasn't Jake's voice. The words were right, the tone was friendly and reassuring, but something was fundamentally wrong with the sound. It was like a recording played at the wrong speed, or a voice from the bottom of a well. Elena grabbed my arm. "That's not him," she whispered. "Jake," I called again. "Are you okay?" "Of course I'm okay," came the response, still in that wrong voice. "Why wouldn't I be okay? Everything is fine here. Everything is perfect." A chill ran down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight and crawled out of the tent, ignoring Elena's protests. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating Jake's tent about 20 feet away. The fabric was intact, no signs of damage, but something dark was pooled around the base. I crept closer, my heart hammering in my chest. The dark substance was liquid, thick and glossy in the flashlight beam. When the light hit it directly, it reflected with a deep red gleam. Blood. "Jake!" I called one more time, my voice barely above a whisper. The tent zipper began to open slowly from the inside. First an inch, then wider, until I could see into the dark interior. Something moved in the shadows, a pale shape that might have been a face. "I'm fine," Jake's voice said again. But now I could see that the mouth wasn't moving in sync with the words. "Come closer, Sarah. Come see how fine I am." I stumbled backward, nearly falling over the dead fire. Elena was beside me now, having ignored my order to stay in the tent. She grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the trees. "We have to find Marcus," she whispered. We circled the campsite, staying well away from Jake's tent. The thing inside continued to speak in Jake's voice, calling our names, begging us to come closer, promising that everything was fine. But the words came at wrong intervals, overlapping and echoing as if spoken by multiple mouths. We found Marcus's sleeping bag empty, his gear scattered around the area where he'd been keeping watch. His flashlight lay on the ground, still on, the beam cutting a bright circle in the dirt. But there was no sign of Marcus himself. "Marcus!" Elena called into the darkness. "Marcus, where are you?" An answer came from the trees beyond the cemetery. Marcus's voice, calm and friendly. "I'm here. I found something amazing. Come see." But the voice was wrong, too, distorted in the same way Jake's had been. And it was coming from at least 3 different directions at once. Elena started toward the sound, but I held her back. "It's not him," I said. "Whatever took Jake has Marcus, too. Then what do we do?" Elena's voice was rising toward panic. I looked around our small camp, the strange grave markers, the blood-stained fire ring, Jake's tent with its unnatural occupant. The wrongness of the place seemed to pulse around us like a living thing, growing stronger with each passing moment. "We run," I said. We grabbed our essential gear, water, first aid kit, my backpack with food, and fled into the forest. Behind us, the voices of our friends called out, pleading for us to come back, promising that everything was fine, that they just wanted to show us something wonderful. The voices followed us for almost a mile before finally fading into the whispers of the trees. We ran without direction, crashing through underbrush and stumbling over roots in our haste to escape. My flashlight beam jumped wildly, creating a strobe effect that made navigation nearly impossible. Branches tore at our clothes and faces, and more than once we nearly ran headfirst into low-hanging limbs. Eventually, exhaustion forced us to stop. We found ourselves in another small clearing, this one thankfully free of grave markers. Elena collapsed against a fallen log, gasping for breath. "What were those things?" she panted. I shook my head. "I don't know, but they weren't Jake and Marcus." Elena pulled out her phone, a useless gesture since we'd had no signal for hours. The screen showed no service and a battery level of 30%. My own phone was dead, the battery mysteriously drained despite being fully charged when we started hiking. "We need to find the trail," I said, "get back to the parking area and get help." But which way was the trail? In our panicked flight, we'd lost all sense of direction. The trees looked the same in every direction. Massive pines and hardwoods draped with Spanish moss, creating a natural cathedral that blocked out most of the sky. Without the sun or stars for reference, we were completely lost. Elena stood up and started walking toward what she thought was north. "This way," she said with false confidence. The river was behind us at the campsite, so the trail should be this direction. I followed, though I had serious doubts about her navigation. We walked for what felt like hours, moving through terrain that seemed increasingly unfamiliar. The trees grew stranger, their bark smooth and pale in the flashlight beam. The Spanish moss hung in thicker curtains, forcing us to push through the gray strands like spider webs, and everywhere the whispers followed us. They were stronger here, more insistent. Multiple voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize, rising and falling in complex harmonies. Sometimes they sounded like singing, sometimes like sobbing, and occasionally I could swear I heard my own name woven into the incomprehensible words. "Sarah," Elena said suddenly, stopping so abruptly I nearly ran into her. "Look." Ahead of us, barely visible through the moss and undergrowth, was a structure. At first glance, it looked like a small cabin, but as we approached, I realized it was something else entirely. It was a church, or had been once. The building was tiny, no larger than a single room, with a simple peaked roof and a small bell tower. But it was old, incredibly old, and built from materials I didn't recognize. The walls appeared to be made from white stone, the same pale material we'd seen in the grave markers, but they curved in ways that hurt to look at directly. The windows were dark, their glass either broken or so old it had turned opaque. The door hung open, revealing an interior black as a cave mouth. "We shouldn't go in there," I said, but Elena was already walking toward the building. "It's shelter," she said. And maybe there's something inside that can tell us where we are. I wanted to argue, wanted to grab her and drag her away from the obviously cursed structure. But I was exhausted, terrified, and rapidly losing my grip on rational thought. The idea of getting out of the open forest, even into something as ominous as this ancient church, was suddenly appealing. Elena reached the door first and peered into the darkness. "I can't see anything," she said. "Hand me your flashlight." I passed her the light, and she stepped across the threshold. The beam illuminated the interior, a simple room with a dirt floor and stone walls. At the far end stood what might once have been an altar, though it was unlike any church altar I'd ever seen. Instead of a simple table, this was a complex arrangement of white stones forming spirals and circles that matched the patterns we'd seen in the cemetery. But it was the walls that made me gasp. They were covered in symbols, thousands of them, carved deep into the white stone. Some looked like letters from alphabets I didn't recognize. Others were pictures, trees, animals, human figures in various poses. And everywhere, mixed in with the other carvings, were names. Recent names. Names carved in modern lettering with dates from the past few decades. "Elena," I called softly. "We need to leave. Now." But Elena was walking toward the altar, transfixed by something I couldn't see. "There's something here," she said, her voice distant and dreamy. "Something important." I followed her into the church and immediately felt the wrongness intensify. The air inside was thick and stifling, like breathing soup. My skin crawled with the sensation of invisible insects, and the whispers rose to an almost deafening level. Elena had reached the altar and was staring at something carved into the central stone. When I joined her, I saw what had captured her attention. It was a map, or at least I thought it was a map. Lines and curves spread across the stone surface, marked with symbols and notations in that strange alphabet. Some areas were highlighted with deep gouges, and others were stained dark with what looked like old blood. "It's beautiful," Elena whispered, reaching out to touch the carving. I grabbed her wrist. "Don't touch it." She turned to me, and in the flashlight beam, I saw that her eyes had changed. They were still brown, still Elena's eyes, but there was something else behind them now, something old and hungry and utterly inhuman. "It's showing me things," she said in a voice that was almost her own. "Such wonderful things, Sarah. Do you want to see?" I backed away from her, my heart hammering. "Elena, we need to get out of here. Something's wrong with this place." She laughed, a sound like silver bells mixed with the cry of hunting birds. "Nothing's wrong. Everything is exactly as it should be, as it was always meant to be." Elena, or the thing wearing Elena's face, reached out and pressed both palms against the carved map. The moment her skin touched the stone, the church filled with light. Not normal light. This was cold and blue-white, emanating from the symbols carved into the walls. They pulsed in sequence, creating patterns that seemed to move and shift like living things. The whispers became a roar, then faded to perfect silence. In that silence I heard Elena speak, but not with her voice. This voice was ancient, powerful, and completely inhuman. "Welcome, Sarah Rodriguez. We have been waiting for you." I ran. I crashed through the church door and into the forest, leaving Elena behind with whatever had possessed her. My flashlight was gone, dropped in my panic, so I ran blind through the darkness. Branches tore at my clothes and face, roots caught my feet and sent me stumbling, but I kept running. Behind me, I could hear Elena, or the thing that had been Elena, calling my name in a voice that shifted between her familiar tone and something else entirely. The sound followed me through the trees, never getting closer but never fading either. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, then stumbled forward until I couldn't take another step. I collapsed beside a massive pine tree, gasping for breath and trying to orient myself in the absolute darkness. That's when I realized I could see light ahead. Not the cold blue glow from the church, but warm, yellow light like firelight or electric bulbs. I forced myself to my feet and stumbled toward it, hope rising in my chest for the first time in hours. The light was coming from windows, actual windows in an actual building. As I got closer, I could see it was a ranger station, a small log structure with a peaked roof and a porch across the front. Warm light spilled from the windows and I could see a truck parked outside. I ran to the door and pounded on it with both fists. "Help!" I shouted. "Please, I need help." The door opened to reveal a park ranger, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a concerned expression. Behind him, I could see a comfortable office with maps on the walls and a coffee pot brewing on a side table. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked, taking in my torn clothes and scratched face. "What happened to you?" I burst into tears of relief. "My friends," I sobbed. "Something happened to my friends. We were camping at the Nesh's Bluff site, and something took them. They're not human anymore. We need to call for help." The ranger stepped aside and ushered me into the office. "Sit down," he said gently, guiding me to a chair. "Let me get you some water, and you can tell me everything." He handed me a bottle of water and sat down across from me. I drank greedily, realizing I was desperately dehydrated, then launched into my story. I told him about the GPS malfunction, the strange cemetery, the whispers, and what had happened to Jake and Marcus. I told him about Elena in the church, about the possession or whatever it had been. The ranger listened patiently, nodding at appropriate points and asking clarifying questions. He seemed to believe me, which was more than I dared hope for. "This happens sometimes," he said when I finished. "The Nesh's Bluff area has always been problematic. We try to steer people away from it, but there's only so much we can do. Some folks just don't listen." "You know about this?" I asked, incredulous. "You know what's out there and you still let people camp?" The ranger's expression grew sad. "We can't close the whole forest based on stories and legends. But yes, we know. There have been incidents over the years, people going in and coming out different, or not coming out at all." He stood and walked to a file cabinet, pulling out a thick folder. "These are the reports from the past 20 years, he said, laying it on the desk. "Missing persons, strange encounters, people found wandering with no memory of what happened to them." I opened the folder and immediately wished I hadn't. Dozens of reports, hundreds of pages documenting disappearances and worse. Photos of people found in the forest, their faces blank and their eyes empty. Statements from survivors describing encounters similar to mine, and running through all of it, references to the same area, the Nesh's Bluff campsite and the White Stone Church. "What is it?" I asked. "What's out there?" The ranger shook his head. "Nobody knows for sure. The local Cado tribes have stories about it. They say the area was cursed long before Europeans arrived. Some kind of entity that feeds on human consciousness takes people over from the inside. They called it the Whispering Death. But my friends are probably gone," he said gently. "I'm sorry, but that's the truth. Whatever took them, they're not coming back. Not as themselves." I spent the rest of the night in the ranger station, giving a formal statement and calling the police. A search team went out at first light, but I already knew what they'd find. Nothing. No trace of Jake, Marcus, or Elena. No sign they'd ever existed except for the gear we'd left behind. The official report listed them as missing persons, presumably lost in the wilderness. The file was thick with similar cases, people who'd gone into the Nesh's Bluff area and simply vanished. Sometimes their equipment was found. Sometimes their cars remained in the parking area for weeks before being towed. But the people themselves were never seen again. Or rather, they were never seen as themselves again. Because I did see them once more, about a month later. I was driving back to Houston on Highway 7, trying to put the whole experience behind me, when I stopped for gas in a small town called Ratcliffe. As I was filling my tank, I saw them across the street. Jake, Marcus, and Elena, standing in front of a diner. They looked exactly the same as they had before our camping trip. Same clothes, same faces, same general posture. But their eyes were wrong. Empty. and they moved with an unnatural synchronization, like marionettes controlled by the same puppeteer. They saw me looking and smiled identical smiles that never reached those empty eyes. Then they waved, all three of them raising their right hands in perfect unison, and walked into the diner. I drove away without finishing filling my tank and haven't been back to East Texas since, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers. They call my name in Elena's voice, promising to show me wonderful things if I'll just come back to the forest. They remind me that I left my friends behind, that I abandoned them to whatever lives in that white stone church. And sometimes, in my darkest moments, I'm tempted to listen, because the truth is, part of me never left that place. Part of me is still standing in that ancient church, watching Elena press her palms against the carved stone and seeing the hunger in her eyes. Part of me is still running through the darkness, pursued by voices that sound like people I love but aren't people at all. The Rangers were right. Some people who go into the Neches Bluff area don't come out the same, and some of us don't come out at all. Not really. We carry that place with us, that wrongness, like an infection that never quite heals. I've moved twice since then, changed my phone number, even dyed my hair and started using my middle name instead of Sarah. But it doesn't matter. Distance means nothing to whatever lives in that forest. It knows where I am, and it's patient. Someday, I know I'll go back. Not because I want to, but because I have to. Because there's a stone in that cemetery with my name on it, and an empty grave waiting to be filled. And when that day comes, I'll walk back into the Neches Bluff area, past the warning signs and the ranger station, down the trail that leads to the Whispering Pines. I'll find my friends waiting for me with their empty eyes and perfect smiles, and they'll welcome me home. Because in the end, we all belong to the forest. We always have. We just didn't know it yet. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote backcountry of Big Bend National Park, Texas, 3 months ago. I'm writing this down because the doctors say it might help, though I know they don't believe what I'm telling them. They think the isolation and stress broke something in my mind. Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm the one who's wrong about what happened out there. But I still wake up screaming Sarah's name. The plan had been simple enough. 4 old college friends, a long weekend in the Texas wilderness, reconnecting after years of scattered lives and digital relationships. Jessica Davis had suggested it. She was always the organizer, the one who kept us together even when geography and careers pulled us in different directions. She'd been planning this trip for months, researching the most remote corners of Big Bend where we could disappear from the world for a few days. No cell service, no internet. Just us in the desert, she'd said over our video call in late September. Like old times. Brandon Edwards had been hesitant. He'd always been the cautious one, the accountant who calculated risks and kept receipts. But even he'd admitted he needed a break from his divorce proceedings and the stress of starting over at 30. Sarah Rodriguez had been the most excited. She'd just finished her residency at Houston Methodist and was burning out from the endless hours and pressure. The outdoors had always been her escape, and she'd been the one to suggest we tackle one of the more challenging backcountry routes. I'd agreed because I trusted them. Because we'd been through everything together. College, heartbreak, career changes, family deaths. Because I thought I knew them as well as I knew myself. I was wrong about a lot of things. We met at Jessica's apartment in Austin on Thursday evening, loading gear into her Jeep Cherokee. The back was packed with tents, sleeping bags, camp stoves, and enough food for 5 days. Brandon had brought his expensive GPS unit and topographic maps spread across Jessica's kitchen table like battle plans. "The trail starts here," he said, pointing to a spot on the map about 15 miles southwest of Santa Elena Canyon. "There's an old ranch road that gets us most of the way to the trailhead, then it's 12 miles of hiking to reach this valley." His finger traced a remote area marked with elevation lines and very little else. "How do you know about this place?" I asked. Sarah looked up from stuffing her backpack. "I found it on some hiking forums." Supposed to be incredible. Completely isolated, natural springs, caves, the kind of place you can't find anymore. How isolated? Brandon asked, and I could hear the concern in his voice. Perfect, isolated, Jessica said. No day hikers, no cell towers, no helicopter tours, just us and the desert. The drive down was 5 hours of gradually emptying highways, the Austin suburbs giving way to hill country, then the flat expanse of South Texas. We stopped for supplies in Marathon, a tiny town that felt like the last outpost of civilization. The clerk at the general store, a weathered man with eyes like chips of flint, studied our permits and shook his head. "Y'all sure about that area?" he asked. "Gets mighty cold out there at night this time of year, and people sometimes get turned around." "We have GPS," Brandon said, patting his expensive unit. The old man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Sure you do." The ranch road was worse than the map suggested. 20 miles of washboard dirt that rattled our teeth and coated everything in fine dust. Jessica's Jeep handled it better than we'd hoped, but by the time we reached the trailhead, the sun was already setting behind the Chisos Mountains, painting the desert in shades of blood and shadow. "We should camp here tonight," Brandon said, studying the terrain. "Start fresh in the morning." But Sarah was already shouldering her pack. "Come on, we can get a few miles in before dark. I want to see those stars without any light pollution." She was right about the stars. By the time we'd hiked 3 miles into the desert, the sky had exploded into a tapestry of light that made the city seem like a pale shadow. We made camp in a small canyon, sheltered from the wind by limestone walls that seemed to glow in the moonlight. The first strange thing happened while we were setting up camp. Brandon's GPS unit, which had been working perfectly all day, suddenly started showing our location as somewhere in New Mexico. He cursed and reset it, but the readings remained scrambled. "Must be interference from the rock formations," Jessica said, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty. "Since when do rocks interfere with satellites?" I asked. Brandon shrugged and put the unit away. "We have maps. We'll be fine." We should have turned back then. God, we should have just gone home. That first night I woke to the sound of something moving through our camp. Not walking, sliding, like something being dragged across the rocky ground. I lay in my sleeping bag, heart hammering, listening to the soft scraping sound circle our tents. When I finally worked up the courage to unzip the door, there was nothing there, just the desert, silver pale in the starlight, and the wind moving through the creosote bushes. "Bad dream?" Sarah whispered from her tent nearby. "Yeah," I said. "Just a bad dream." But in the morning, we found long gouges in the dirt around our camp, too straight and too deep to be from any animal. Brandon examined them with the intensity he usually reserved for spreadsheets. "Probably just the wind," he said, but he sounded like he was trying to convince himself. Jessica laughed, but it was forced. "What, the wind has claws now?" "Let's just pack up," Sarah said. She was staring at the marks with an expression I couldn't read. "We've got a long day ahead." The second day's hike took us deeper into the backcountry, following a barely visible trail through landscapes that seemed older than time. The desert here was different, more alive somehow, but in a way that made my skin crawl. The cacti seemed larger, more twisted, reaching toward the sky like gnarled fingers. The silence was so complete it hurt. Brandon's map became increasingly useless as the day wore on. Landmarks that should have been visible were hidden by ridges that shouldn't exist. Springs marked on the topographic survey were nothing but dry hollows filled with bleached bones. "Are we lost?" I asked during our afternoon break. Brandon spread the map on a flat rock weighing down the corners with stones. "I don't know. The terrain doesn't match what's here." "How can terrain not match?" Jessica asked. "It can't," he said, "unless these maps are wrong, or we're not where we think we are." Sarah was standing apart from us, staring into the distance. When I followed her gaze, I saw nothing but empty desert stretching to the horizon, but she was watching something, her body tense with concentration. "Sarah, what is it?" She turned to me with a smile that seemed too wide, too bright. "Nothing. Just thought I heard something." "Heard what?" "Someone calling my name." The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees in the space of a heartbeat. We made camp that evening in a natural amphitheater of red stone, surrounded by walls that rose 50 feet on all sides. It felt protected, hidden, but as darkness fell, I began to realize it also felt like a trap. Jessica tried to light our campfire, but the wood wouldn't catch. She tried again with fresh kindling, more matches, even lighter fluid, but every flame died before it could take hold. "It's the wind," she said, but there was no wind. The air was still as death. When the flames finally caught on her 6th attempt, they burned blue-white instead of orange, casting strange shadows that seemed to move independently of the fire itself. "That's not normal," Brandon said. Sarah laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Nothing about this place is normal." I looked at her sharply. There was something different in her voice, something that made the hair on my arms stand up. But when she met my eyes, she was just Sarah. Tired, maybe a little stressed, but still the woman I'd known for 10 years. We ate dinner in relative silence. The only sounds the crackling of our unnatural fire and the distant call of coyotes. But as night deepened, other sounds began to emerge from the darkness beyond our camp. Soft whispers that might have been wind through stone. The sound of breathing that didn't match our rhythm. Footsteps circling us just beyond the reach of our light. "Do you hear that?" Jessica whispered. We all heard it. The sound of someone, or something, moving through the rocks above us. Not trying to hide, but not making any effort to announce itself either. Just there, watching, waiting. Brandon grabbed his flashlight and swept the beam across the canyon walls. For just a moment, I thought I saw something pale and thin pressed against the rock, but then the light moved and there was nothing. "Just animals," he said, but his voice shook. "Animals don't sound like that," I said. The whispers were getting louder, more distinct. I could almost make out words, syllables that seemed familiar but wrong, like a language I'd once known but had forgotten. Sarah stood up suddenly, her movement so abrupt it made us all jump. "I need to pee," she said. "Don't go alone," Jessica said immediately. "I'll be fine. It's just behind those rocks." She gestured to a cluster of boulders maybe 20 feet from our fire, close enough that we could see her silhouette, far enough that she'd have privacy. "Take a flashlight," I called after her. "Don't need one," she said. "I can see fine." And that was another wrong thing, because our fire gave off almost no light, and the moon was hidden behind clouds. But she walked into the darkness like she could see perfectly, like she belonged there. She was gone for maybe 5 minutes. When she came back, she was smiling. "Feel better?" Jessica asked. "Much," Sarah said, and settled back down by the fire. But something had changed. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. She looked the same, sounded the same, even smelled the same. That faint scent of shampoo and desert dust. But she wasn't blinking. Not once in the 20 minutes we sat there finishing our dinner did I see her blink. When I mentioned it to Brandon later, after the girls had gone to bed, he looked at me like I was losing my mind. "People blink, Mike. It's involuntary. You're just paranoid because of this place." Maybe he was right. Maybe the isolation and the strange events were getting to me. But I lay awake in my tent that night, listening to the sound of breathing from Sarah's tent next to mine. Regular, steady breathing that never paused, never changed rhythm, like a machine mimicking sleep. The third day brought new horrors. I woke to find our food supplies ruined, not eaten or scattered, but rotted, as if they'd been sitting in the desert sun for weeks instead of hours. The water in our bottles had turned murky and tasted of sulfur. Even the sealed packages were somehow contaminated, crawling with insects that shouldn't exist in this climate. "How is this possible?" Jessica asked, holding up a can of beans that had swollen and burst overnight. "Desert heat," Brandon said, but even he sounded doubtful. "Maybe we left them too close to the fire." Our fire had been cold for hours. Sarah was examining a package of trail mix that had turned black and begun to smell like decay. She poked at it with a stick, and I swear I saw it move, pulsing like something alive. "We should head back," I said. "This is getting dangerous." "We can't," Brandon said, studying his compass. "Look at this." The needle was spinning freely, unable to find magnetic north. When he tried his backup compass, it pointed in a completely different direction. "So we use the sun," Jessica said. But the sun was wrong too. I'd been hiking and camping for years, and I knew how to navigate by celestial bodies. But here, the sun seemed to move too fast across the sky, and its position didn't match what it should be for this time of day and this latitude. "We're not lost," Sarah said suddenly. "We're exactly where we're supposed to be." There was something in her voice that made me look at her sharply. She was standing with her back to us, staring into the desert, and for a moment I could have sworn her reflection in a nearby pool of water showed someone else entirely. "What do you mean?" I asked. She turned around and her smile was all wrong. Too wide, stretching her face in ways that human faces shouldn't stretch. "I mean, this place has been waiting for us. All our lives, this place has been calling us here." "Sarah, you're scaring me," Jessica said. "Am I?" Sarah tilted her head at an angle that was just slightly too far to be natural. "Or are you finally waking up to what this place really is?" I wanted to grab Jessica and Brandon and run. But run where? We were 3 days into the desert with no working navigation equipment and spoiled supplies. Even if we could find our way back to the trailhead, we'd never make it without water. "We need to find the springs," Brandon said, consulting his useless map. "There should be a water source about 2 miles north of here." "I know where it is," Sarah said. "I can take us there." "How do you know?" I asked. "I just do." The springs, when we found them, were not what we expected. Instead of the clear, life-giving water we desperately needed, we found a series of dark pools that reflected no light, surrounded by vegetation that had grown too large and too green for the desert climate. The smell was overwhelming. Not just sulfur, but something deeper, older, the smell of things that had been dead for a very long time. "We can't drink this," Jessica said, staring into one of the pools. "Why not?" Sarah asked. "It's just water." "Look at it, Sarah. It's black. It's not moving. There are no insects, no birds, nothing alive here." Sarah knelt by the nearest pool and cupped some of the dark water in her hands. Before any of us could stop her, she drank deeply. "Sarah, no!" I lunged forward, but she was already swallowing. She straightened up, water running down her chin, and smiled. "It's perfect," she said. "Sweet as honey." Brandon grabbed a water purification tablet from his pack. "We'll treat it first, then—" "No need," Sarah said. She was back at the pool, drinking again, this time directly from the source. When she lifted her head, her lips were stained black. That night, she disappeared. I woke sometime after midnight to silence. Not the natural quiet of the desert, but complete, absolute silence. No wind, no insects, no breathing from the tent next to mine. I lay there for several minutes, trying to convince myself that everything was normal, that Sarah was just sleeping soundly. Then I heard her voice, soft and sweet, calling to me from somewhere beyond our camp. "Mike, Mike, come here. I want to show you something." I unzipped my tent and looked out. Sarah's tent was empty, the sleeping bag thrown back as if she'd left in a hurry, or as if something had pulled her out. "Sarah?" I called softly. "Over here," came her voice, but it seemed to come from multiple directions at once. Jessica and Brandon were awake now, emerging from their tents with flashlights. "Where is she?" Jessica asked. "I don't know. She was just here." We searched for an hour, calling her name, sweeping our lights across the canyon walls and through the scattered boulders. We found her tracks leading away from camp, but they ended abruptly at a sheer rock wall as if she'd simply vanished into the stone. "People don't just disappear," Brandon said, but his voice lacked conviction. People don't do a lot of things we've seen in the last 3 days, I replied. We spent the rest of the night huddled together by our blue-burning fire, taking turns staying awake to watch for any sign of Sarah's return. When dawn came, painting the canyon walls in shades of red and gold, we found her sitting calmly by the dead springs, fully dressed, her back to us. "Sarah," Jessica called out, relief evident in her voice. "Where have you been?" Sarah turned around slowly, and I knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. Her movements were too fluid, too controlled. Her face was perfectly composed, not a trace of concern or confusion. And her eyes were completely black, like pools of oil reflecting nothing. "I've been exploring," she said, and her voice was different, flatter somehow, as if all emotion had been drained out of it. "Exploring where?" I asked. "We looked everywhere." "Did you?" She stood up with an unnatural grace, no effort or awkwardness in the movement. "Maybe you weren't looking in the right places." Jessica approached her cautiously. "Sarah, are you okay? You look different." "I feel wonderful," Sarah said. "Better than I've ever felt. This place, it's liberating." She walked past us toward our camp, and I caught a whiff of her scent. Not the familiar smell of shampoo and skin, but something else. Something rotten and sweet, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. "We need to leave," I said quietly to Brandon. "Right now." "With what navigation? What water?" he whispered back. "We're stuck here until we can figure out where we are." But I was becoming increasingly certain that where we were wasn't the issue. The issue was what this place was doing to us, what it had already done to Sarah. Sarah didn't eat that day. She claimed she wasn't hungry, that the water from the springs had satisfied all her needs. She sat apart from us during our meal breaks, staring into the desert with those black, unblinking eyes, occasionally smiling at things only she could see. "Sarah, talk to me," Jessica pleaded during our afternoon rest. "Tell me what happened last night." "I told you, I was exploring." "Exploring what?" Sarah's smile widened until it looked painful. "The spaces between things. The places where the normal rules don't apply. This desert is full of doors, Jessica. Doors to incredible places." "You're scaring us," Brandon said. "Why?" Sarah's head tilted at that impossible angle again. "Are you afraid of doors?" When we made camp that evening, Sarah volunteered to gather firewood. She walked into the desert as the sun was setting, moving with that strange fluid grace, and returned 20 minutes later dragging branches that were still green and alive, torn from plants that shouldn't exist in this climate. The fire she built burned higher and hotter than any campfire I'd ever seen, the flames reaching 10 feet into the air and casting dancing shadows that seemed to tell stories of their own. But still, it burned blue-white, and the heat it gave off was cold instead of warm. "This isn't normal," I said to Jessica and Brandon when Sarah walked away to check our perimeter. "Nothing about this trip has been normal," Jessica replied. "But what choice do we have? She's our friend, Mike. She's been our friend for 10 years. Look at her," I said. "Really look at her. When was the last time you saw her blink? When was the last time she seemed to breathe? That's not Sarah anymore." Brandon was studying his compass again, watching the needle spin aimlessly. "Even if you're right, what do you suggest we do? We're lost in the middle of nowhere with no supplies and no navigation. Without her, we'll die out here. With her, we might die anyway." As if summoned by our conversation, Sarah appeared at the edge of our firelight. She'd been gone for maybe 5 minutes, but somehow she looked different again. Taller, maybe, or thinner, her proportions slightly off in ways that made my eyes hurt to focus on her. "What are you talking about?" she asked, though she showed no curiosity in her tone. "Just trying to figure out how to get home," Jessica said. "Home?" Sarah laughed, and the sound was like glass breaking in a distant room. "This is home now. Can't you feel it? The way this place embraces us? The way it shows us who we really are?" "I want to go back to Austin," Jessica said firmly. Do you? Sarah moved closer, and I could see that her skin had taken on a waxy, translucent quality. Or do you just think you should want that because it's what you're supposed to want? Sarah, please. I'm not Sarah. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. We all stared at her, and she stared back with those bottomless black eyes, still smiling that terrible smile. What? Jessica whispered. I'm not Sarah. The thing that looked like our friend repeated. Sarah is gone. Sarah is sleeping in the spaces between things, dreaming beautiful dreams. I'm what came back in her place. I was already moving, grabbing my pack and backing away from the fire. Run, I said to Jessica and Brandon. Run now. Sure, but Brandon was frozen, staring at the Sarah thing with his mouth open. Jessica was shaking her head in denial. No, she said. No, this is just stress. This is just the isolation getting to us. Sarah, stop playing games. The Sarah thing's head rotated 180 degrees, her body remaining perfectly still while her face turned to look directly behind her. I'm not playing, she said, her voice now coming from the wrong direction. I'm hunting. What happened next is hard to describe, partly because it happened so fast and partly because my mind keeps trying to reject what I saw. The Sarah thing moved like liquid lightning, crossing the 15 feet between herself and Brandon in what seemed like a single fluid motion. Her fingers, which had been normal human fingers moments before, were now long and sharp and ended in claws that gleamed like polished bone. Brandon didn't even have time to scream. She opened his throat with a casual swipe, as if she were brushing away a cobweb. Blood sprayed across the canyon wall, black in the firelight, and Brandon collapsed, making wet, choking sounds as his life poured out into the desert sand. Jessica screamed then, a sound of pure animal terror that echoed off the canyon walls and seemed to go on forever. She scrambled backward, trying to get away, but the Sarah thing was already turning toward her, those black eyes fixed on her with predatory interest. I didn't think. I grabbed the largest burning branch from our fire and swung it at the creature's head. The impact sent sparks flying and knocked her sideways, but she rolled with the blow and came up in a crouch, grinning at me. That hurt, she said, sounding delighted. Do it again. Instead, I grabbed Jessica's hand and ran. We fled through the darkness, stumbling over rocks and crashing through thorn bushes, driven by pure terror and adrenaline. Behind us, I could hear laughter. Sarah's laughter, but wrong, distorted, like an echo bouncing back from some impossible depth. This way, I gasped, pulling Jessica toward what looked like a gap in the canyon wall. Where are we going? She sobbed. Anywhere but here. The gap led to a narrow passage between towering rock walls, barely wide enough for us to squeeze through single file. It was pitch black, and we had to feel our way forward, our hands scraping against stone as we tried to navigate by touch. Behind us, the laughter stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. Mike, Jessica whispered, what was that thing? I don't know. It looked like Sarah. It moved like Sarah. It had her voice. I know. But it wasn't her. No, it wasn't. We emerged from the passage into another canyon, this one smaller and more enclosed than where we'd been camping. High walls surrounded us on all sides, and I could see stars overhead, but they were in the wrong positions, forming constellations I didn't recognize. We need to find a way out of here, I said. Which way? That was the problem. In the darkness, every direction looked the same. The canyon seemed to branch in multiple directions, but without light, we could only guess which path might lead to safety and which might lead us deeper into this nightmare. We chose a direction at random and began walking, our footsteps echoing strangely in the confined space. The echoes seemed to multiply as we moved, as if invisible companions were walking alongside us. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, we heard the voice again. Jessica, it called sweetly. Mike, where are you going? Don't you want to play? It was closer than it should have been. Much closer. How did it find us so fast? Jessica whispered. I didn't answer, because I was beginning to suspect that in this place, normal rules like distance and time didn't apply. The Sarah thing could be anywhere it wanted to be, whenever it wanted to be there. This way, I said, pulling Jessica down a side passage. But we'd only gone a few steps when we saw a pale figure blocking our path. Even in the darkness, I could make out that familiar silhouette, that beloved face twisted into something monstrous. Going somewhere? The Sarah thing asked. We turned and ran back the way we'd come. But she was there too, somehow ahead of us again. She was everywhere and nowhere, a nightmare that bent space around itself. There's no escape, she said, her voice coming from all directions at once. This place doesn't let things go. It collects them, keeps them, makes them part of itself. What do you want? I shouted. I want you to stop running. I want you to accept what this place is offering you. I want you to let go of all those silly human concerns and become something wonderful. Like you did to Sarah? Sarah is happy. Sarah is dreaming beautiful dreams. She doesn't need her body anymore. I'm taking much better care of it than she ever did. Jessica was sobbing beside me, great gasping sobs that shook her whole body. I put my arm around her, trying to offer what comfort I could, but I knew we were trapped. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The thing that had been our friend was going to kill us, or worse, do whatever it had done to Sarah. Then I remembered something, a detail that had seemed unimportant at the time but now felt like our only hope. The fire, I said to Jessica. When I hit it with the burning branch, it actually hurt. Fire hurts it. We don't have any fire. We have matches. We have Brandon's lighter. I fumbled in my pack, searching desperately for anything combustible. My fingers closed around a small bottle of hand sanitizer, alcohol-based, flammable. The Sarah thing was approaching us slowly now, savoring our fear. In the starlight, I could see that her form was shifting, becoming less human with each step. Her limbs were too long, her joints bent at impossible angles, and her face was beginning to stretch and distort like molten wax. Don't be afraid, she said in Sarah's voice. It only hurts for a moment. Then you'll be free. Free from all the pain and doubt and loneliness that makes human life so difficult. I squeezed sanitizer onto my shirt and struck a match. The fabric caught immediately, burning bright and hot. The Sarah thing hissed and stepped backward, her form wavering like smoke. That won't help you for long, she said. Fire dies, but I am eternal. She was right. The flame was already beginning to die down, and I had very little alcohol left. But maybe it would be enough to get us out of this canyon, back to where we'd left our supplies. Run, I told Jessica. I'll hold it off. I'm not leaving you. You have to. One of us needs to get out of here. One of us needs to tell people what happened. The flame was guttering now, casting wild shadows on the canyon walls. The Sarah thing was moving closer, her form becoming more solid, more threatening. Go! I shouted. Jessica ran. I don't remember much about what happened next. The flame died, and the Sarah thing fell on me like a collapsing building. I felt those impossible claws rake across my chest, opening wounds that burned like acid. I felt teeth that were too sharp and too many sink into my shoulder. But somehow, impossibly, I got away. Maybe the creature was playing with me, or maybe it was distracted by pursuing Jessica. Maybe I was just lucky. But I found myself running through the darkness, bleeding and half-conscious, following the sound of Jessica's sobs. I found her collapsed at the entrance to our original canyon, hyperventilating and shaking. Our camp was exactly as we'd left it, except for Brandon's body and the pools of blood already beginning to dry in the desert air. We have to get out of here, I said. How? We don't know where we are. We don't have any navigation equipment. We follow our own trail back. We retrace our steps until we reach the trailhead. That's 3 days' walk. We don't have enough water. Then we die trying, because the alternative is staying here with that thing. We gathered what supplies we could, our remaining water, some emergency food that hadn't been contaminated, a first aid kit to treat my wounds. We left Brandon's body because there was nothing else we could do, and we set out into the desert as the first light of dawn began to creep across the sky. Ian, the next 2 days were a blur of pain, exhaustion, and terror. We followed our trail when we could find it, guessed when we couldn't. The sun beat down on us mercilessly during the day, and the cold bit into our bones at night. We rationed our water carefully, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. And always, somewhere behind us, we could hear laughter. Jessica began hallucinating on the second day, talking to people who weren't there, seeing impossible things shimmering in the heat haze. I wasn't much better. My wounds had become infected, and fever was making the world spin and twist around me. But we kept walking. On the morning of the third day, when I was certain we were going to die of dehydration and exhaustion, we crested a ridge and saw Jessica's Jeep in the distance, sitting exactly where we'd left it beside the old ranch road. Jessica started crying. Not tears of fear this time, but tears of relief and gratitude. We'd made it. Somehow, impossibly, we'd escaped. The Jeep started on the first try, and we drove toward decivilization without stopping, without speaking, both of us afraid that if we slowed down or looked back, we'd find that our escape had been just another hallucination. The doctors in Marathon said I'd been attacked by a mountain lion. They treated my wounds and gave me antibiotics for the infection. The park rangers organized a search for Brandon and Sarah, but they never found anything. No bodies, no traces, nothing but our abandoned campsite and some mysterious gouges in the rock. Jessica and I both told the same story. Sarah had wandered off and gotten lost. Brandon had been killed by a mountain lion during a search attempt, and we'd barely escaped with our lives. No one questioned it. It made sense in a way that the truth never would. But I know what really happened out there. I know what took Sarah and what killed Brandon. I know that somewhere in the deep desert, in places that don't appear on any map, there are things older and hungrier than human understanding. Jessica moved to Portland 2 weeks after we got back. She doesn't return my calls anymore. I don't blame her. I remind her of things she'd rather forget. Sometimes, late at night, I get phone calls. No one speaks, but I can hear breathing on the other end of the line. Familiar breathing. Patient breathing. The breathing of something that has all the time in the world to wait for me to come back. Because I think part of me is still out there, in those dark canyons where the rules don't apply. Part of me never left, and sooner or later, the rest of me is going to follow. The dreams started last week. In them, I'm walking through the desert again, following a voice I know I shouldn't trust but can't resist. Sarah's voice calling to me from somewhere beyond the reach of human understanding. "Mike," she says, "Mike, come here. I want to show you something wonderful." And in the dreams, I always go. I always go. Final word count, 6,147 words. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the East Texas wilderness around Cado Lake, in those twisted cypress swamps where Spanish moss hangs like funeral shrouds, and the water reflects nothing but darkness. I should have known something was wrong when my GPS started glitching the moment we crossed into Harrison County. The screen flickered between satellite view and an impossible maze of squiggly lines that looked more like blood vessels than roads. Jake laughed it off from the driver's seat, his calloused hand steady on the wheel as our rented SUV bounced along the increasingly narrow dirt road. "Technology, man," he said, flashing that easy grin that had gotten us through 4 years of college together. "Sometimes you just gotta trust your gut." Sarah shifted in the passenger seat, her auburn hair catching the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the windshield. "Your gut got us lost in the Ozarks last summer," she reminded him, but there was affection in her voice. She'd been dating Jake for 2 years now, and they had that comfortable rhythm that made me simultaneously happy for my best friend and acutely aware of my own loneliness. "That was different," Danny piped up from beside me in the back seat, his voice carrying that familiar note of mischief. "That was Arkansas. This is Texas. Everything's bigger in Texas, including Jake's sense of direction." We all laughed, but the sound felt hollow in the humid air. Outside, the forest was growing denser, the pine trees giving way to ancient cypresses whose roots disappeared into black water. Cado Lake stretched out beyond them, its surface broken by massive tree trunks that rose from the depths like the fingers of drowning giants. I'd suggested this trip after a particularly brutal month at the software company where I worked. 14-hour days debugging code that seemed to develop new problems faster than I could solve them had left me feeling like my brain was slowly liquefying. Danny, who worked in marketing for the same company, had been dealing with his own stress. A recent breakup that he claimed not to care about but that had left him drinking alone in his apartment most nights. Jake worked construction and was always game for outdoor adventures, and Sarah taught elementary school and insisted she needed to reconnect with nature before the new school year started. The plan was simple: 3 days and 2 nights camping in the Cado Lake area, hiking the lesser-known trails, maybe doing some fishing if we could find clear water. I'd researched the area extensively, cross-referencing Park Service maps with online forums and local fishing guides. What I'd found was mostly typical Texas wilderness information. Watch for alligators, avoid the water moccasins, don't drink the swamp water. There had been a few mentions of local legends, stories about lights in the swamp and people who wandered into the deep forest and came back. Different. But every region had its folklore, and I'd dismiss them as the usual small-town ghost stories designed to keep tourists on marked trails. Now, as we drove deeper into the wilderness, those stories didn't seem quite so quaint. The road ended at a small gravel parking area beside a weathered wooden sign that read Cado Lake State Park, Remote Access Point. Below it, in smaller letters that had been partially eaten away by decades of Texas weather, were the words, "Hike at your own risk." "Cheerful," Sarah muttered, shouldering her backpack as we climbed out of the SUV. The air hit us like a damp blanket. It was early September, but the humidity was still crushing, thick enough that you could almost see it shimmering between the trees. The smell was overwhelming. Rich organic decay mixed with stagnant water and something else, something sweet and cloying that reminded me of overripe fruit left in the sun. Jake consulted the paper map he'd printed from the Park Service website. "Campsite 7 should be about 2 miles that way," he said, pointing toward a trail that disappeared into a tunnel of Spanish moss and twisted branches. "It's one of the primitive sites, so no facilities, but it's right on the water." We shouldered our packs and started walking. The trail was barely visible, more of a suggestion than an actual path, marked only by occasional blazes painted on tree trunks. Within minutes, we were surrounded by the kind of silence that seems to press against your eardrums. Even our footsteps were muffled by the thick layer of decomposing leaves that carpeted the forest floor. "This place is fucking creepy," Danny said after we'd been walking for about 20 minutes. His usual joking tone had an edge to it that I'd never heard before. "It's just different from what we're used to," Sarah said, but I noticed she stayed close to Jake, her hand occasionally reaching out to touch his arm. I was taking photographs with my phone, trying to capture the alien beauty of the landscape, when I noticed the battery indicator. It had been at 78% when we started hiking. Now it showed 23%. "Hey guys," I called out. "Is anyone else's phone battery draining really fast?" They all checked. Jake's phone was completely dead, which he claimed happened sometimes when he forgot to charge it. Sarah's was down to 15%, but Danny's phone was the strangest. The screen showed a full battery, but when he tried to open an app, it immediately shut down. "Probably just the humidity," Jake said, but he didn't sound convinced. We pressed on, and I tried to ignore the growing sense that we were being watched. It was just the forest playing tricks on my city-trained senses, I told myself. The way shadows moved when Spanish moss swayed in the breeze, the occasional splash from the direction of the lake that could have been a fish or a turtle or an alligator. Normal wilderness sounds. Except there weren't any normal wilderness sounds. No bird calls, no insect buzz, No rustle of small animals in the undergrowth, just our breathing and the soft squelch of our boots in the increasingly muddy trail. We found Campsite 7 just as the sun was beginning to set. It was a small clearing beside the lake, with a fire ring made of blackened stones and a picnic table that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The wood was gray and splintered, covered in a thin layer of green moss. "Home, sweet home," Jake said, but his voice lacked its usual enthusiasm. We set up our tents in a rough circle around the fire ring, though the ground was so soft and spongy that the stakes barely held. As we worked, I became increasingly aware of the water lapping against the shore just a few feet away. In the fading light, Cado Lake looked like a sheet of black glass, broken only by the cypress trees that rose from its depths. Spanish moss hung from every branch, creating curtains of gray-green that swayed in the humid breeze. "Anyone else think it's weird how quiet it is?" Sarah asked as we finished setting up camp. "Peaceful," Jake corrected, but I could see him glancing toward the tree line. Danny was trying to start a fire, arranging kindling in the ring while Jake soaked some larger pieces of wood with lighter fluid. But when Danny struck a match, something strange happened. The flame was blue. Not the normal yellow-orange of a burning match, but a deep electric blue that seemed to glow rather than burn. "What the hell?" Danny dropped the match, which went out as soon as it hit the damp ground. "Must be something in the wood," Jake said, though he sounded uncertain. "Mineral deposits or something." They tried again. This time the match lit normally, but when it touched the kindling, the flames that sprouted were that same unnatural blue. The fire burned, but it gave off no warmth and very little light. We all stood around it, staring at the cold blue flames that danced and flickered like they were underwater. "I've never seen anything like that," Sarah whispered. We ate dinner in the strange blue light, sandwiches and trail mix that tasted like cardboard in the humid air. The conversation was stilted, punctuated by long silences during which we all listened to the sounds from the swamp. There were sounds now, but not the ones you'd expect. Splashing that seemed too rhythmic to be natural. A sound like breathing, deep and slow, coming from somewhere in the darkness beyond our camp. And once, just once, what sounded like a child crying, faint and distant but unmistakably human. "Should we check that out?" Sarah asked when we heard the crying sound. "Check what out?" Jake said. "We don't even know which direction it came from." But we all knew which direction it had come from. From the water. From somewhere out in that maze of cypress trees and black water where no child should be. We went to our tents early, around 9 o'clock, though it felt much later. The darkness that settled over our camp was absolute, the kind of darkness that seems to have weight and substance. Even with my phone's flashlight, I could barely see my own hands. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the sounds from outside my tent. The breathing was constant now, slow and deep and definitely not natural. And there were footsteps, soft, wet footsteps circling our camp. I wanted to call out to the others, but every instinct I had told me to stay silent, to not draw attention to myself. Sometime during the night, I fell asleep despite my fear. When I woke up, it was to Danny, screaming. I unzipped my tent and crawled out into the gray pre-dawn light. Danny was standing beside the dead fire ring, pointing at something with a shaking hand. "My sleeping bag," he said, his voice high and tight. "Look at my sleeping bag." I looked toward his tent. The sleeping bag was spread out in front of it, and it was opened from the inside. Not unzipped, opened. The fabric was torn in long, parallel gashes, as if something with claws had slashed its way out from within. "That's impossible," Sarah said, emerging from her tent with Jake close behind. "You're standing right here." "I know I'm standing right here," Danny's voice cracked, "but I woke up outside my tent. I was lying on the ground next to the fire ring. I don't remember getting out of my sleeping bag. I don't remember leaving my tent." We all stared at the shredded sleeping bag. The tears were clean and deep, and there were dark stains around the edges that might have been mud, but looked disturbingly like dried blood. "You were sleepwalking?" Jake said, but he didn't sound like he believed it. "I've never sleepwalked in my life," Danny replied. I walked over to examine the sleeping bag more closely. The tears definitely looked like claw marks, but they came from the inside, as if something had been trapped inside the bag and had fought its way out. But Danny was standing right here, completely unharmed. We should pack up, Sarah said quietly. This place. Something's wrong with this place. But when we went to pack our supplies, we discovered the next impossible thing. Our food was gone. Not stolen, rotted. The bread was covered in a thick layer of black mold. The apples had collapsed into themselves, turned to brown mush overnight. Even the canned goods were bulging and leaking, as if they'd been sitting in a hot warehouse for months instead of our backpacks for 12 hours. This doesn't make sense, I said, holding up a can of beans that was so swollen it looked ready to explode. Food doesn't rot like this overnight. Unless it's not overnight, Danny said quietly. We all turned to look at him. What time is it? He asked. I checked my phone, which was somehow back up to 45% battery. The time display was jumping around wildly. 8:47 a.m., then 3:22 p.m., then 11:15 a.m., then back to 18:47. Jake's watch, an old mechanical one that his grandfather had given him, showed 2:30. But the sun was clearly just rising, casting long shadows through the cypress trees. How long were we asleep? Sarah asked. None of us had an answer. We decided to head back to the car, but when we tried to find the trail, it wasn't there. Not just obscured, gone. Where the path had been the day before, there was only dense forest and black water. We came from that direction, Jake said, pointing toward what looked like an impenetrable wall of Spanish moss and cypress roots. Are you sure? I asked. He wasn't sure. None of us were sure. The landscape around our campsite looked completely different in the daylight, as if the forest had rearranged itself while we slept. We spent the morning trying to find our way back, pushing through undergrowth that tore at our clothes and left long scratches on our arms. The ground was spongy and unstable, sometimes giving way beneath our feet and plunging us ankle-deep into stagnant water. The smell was getting worse, too, that sweet, cloying odor of decay that now seemed to follow us wherever we went. It was Danny who first noticed that we were walking in circles. He spotted a cypress tree that he'd marked with his knife, a simple D carved into the bark. We'd passed it 3 times in the last hour. This is impossible, Jake said, staring at the tree. We've been walking in a straight line. But the mark was there, and there were our footprints in the mud around the tree's base, layered on top of each other like we'd been dancing around it. Let's just pick a direction and stick to it, Sarah said. No matter what. Don't turn, don't deviate. Just walk straight until we find the road. We tried. We found a bearing using Jake's compass and started walking, but within minutes we were back at the campsite. Then we tried again, this time in the opposite direction. Same result. It was as if the forest was folding in on itself, creating loops that led back to where we started no matter which way we went. By afternoon, we were exhausted and starting to panic. We'd finished the last of our drinkable water and hadn't found any clear streams. The lake water was thick and dark, covered with a film of algae and decomposing matter that made it obviously unsafe to drink. That's when Danny disappeared. We were taking a break, sitting around the blue-burning fire ring and trying to figure out our next move, when Sarah asked where Danny was. We all looked around. He'd been sitting right there, on the other side of the fire ring, less than 5 minutes ago. Danny, Jake called out. Danny, where are you? Silence. Not even an echo. We searched the immediate area, calling his name and crashing through the undergrowth. But it was like he'd simply vanished. No tracks, no torn clothing caught on branches, no signs of a struggle. One moment he was there, the next he was gone. People don't just disappear, Sarah said, but her voice was shaky. In places like this, they do, I replied, remembering some of the stories I'd read online. People who wandered off trails in the deep wilderness and were never seen again, or who were found days later with no memory of where they'd been. We spent the rest of the afternoon searching, but as the sun began to set again, We had to face the possibility that Danny was gone. Really gone. "We'll find him tomorrow," Jake said, but he didn't sound convinced. "He's probably just turned around, trying to find his way back to the road. He'll figure it out." But I kept thinking about that sleeping bag, torn open from the inside, about the impossible way our food had rotted overnight, about the blue flames that gave no warmth and the time that didn't make sense and the trail that had disappeared. Night fell like a curtain, sudden and absolute. We huddled around our cold blue fire, jumping at every sound from the darkness beyond our camp. The breathing was back, that slow, deep rhythm that seemed to circle us just beyond the range of our vision, and the footsteps, wet, soft footsteps that squelched in the mud around our camp. "There's something out there," Sarah whispered. "It's just animals," Jake said, but his hand was white-knuckled around a large stick he'd picked up to use as a weapon. Around midnight, we heard Danny's voice. "Guys!" he called from somewhere in the darkness. "Guys, where are you? I'm lost." We all jumped up, relief flooding through us despite the strangeness of his tone. His voice sounded flat, emotionless, like he was reading from a script. "Danny," Sarah called back, "we're here. Follow our voices." "Where?" Danny's voice came again, but from a different direction this time. "I can't see you." "We have a fire," Jake shouted. "Can you see the light?" There was a long pause. Then Danny's voice again, closer now. "What fire?" We all looked at each other. The blue flames were clearly visible from where we stood, casting their strange glow over our campsite. "The blue fire," I called out. "Right here at the campsite." Another pause. Then Danny stepped into the light. He looked exactly the same, but something was fundamentally wrong. His movements were too smooth, too fluid, like he was floating just above the ground. His clothes were clean and dry despite having been lost in the swamp for hours. And his eyes reflected the blue firelight like an animal's. "Hi, guys," he said in that same flat tone. "I got lost." "Jesus, Danny, we were worried sick," Sarah said, moving toward him. "Are you okay? You look—" "I'm fine," Danny interrupted, and when he smiled I could see that his teeth were different. Longer, sharper. Jake noticed it too. "Danny," he said carefully, "where have you been?" "Walking," Danny replied. "Just walking around. This place is beautiful at night." But it wasn't Danny. Everything about him was wrong. The way he stood too still, the way he didn't blink, the way his voice carried no emotion whatsoever. And when he moved closer to the fire, I noticed that he cast no shadow. "I think we should all get some sleep," Not Danny said. "Big day tomorrow." He walked to his tent, the one with the shredded sleeping bag still lying in front of it, and crawled inside. We heard the zipper close, and then silence. The three of us sat around the fire staring at Danny's tent. "That's not him," Sarah whispered. "Don't be ridiculous," Jake said, but his voice shook. "He's just traumatized, lost in the woods for hours, probably dehydrated." "Jake," I interrupted quietly, "look at his sleeping bag." We all looked. The sleeping bag that had been torn to ribbons that morning was whole again, lying neatly beside the tent as if nothing had ever happened to it. "We need to leave," Sarah said. "Now. Tonight." "And go where?" Jake asked. "We can't find our way out of here." "Then we stay awake," I said. "All night. We watch that tent, and we don't let whatever's in there near us." But even as I said it, I could feel exhaustion pulling at my consciousness. The events of the past day had drained us physically and emotionally, and my body was demanding sleep despite the terror that gripped my mind. Jake felt it too. I could see his eyelids drooping as he sat by the fire. "We can't all stay awake," he mumbled. "Take shifts, 2 hours each." "No," Sarah said firmly. "No one sleeps. Not until we figure out what happened to Danny." But the exhaustion was overwhelming, like a drug in our bloodstream. One by one, we began to nod off despite our best efforts to stay alert. I woke up to screaming, Sarah's screaming. I bolted upright in my tent. When had I gotten into my tent? And scrambled for the zipper. Outside, the blue fire was still burning, casting its cold light over a scene from a nightmare. Sarah was on the ground beside the fire ring, Danny crouched over her. But it wasn't Danny anymore, not even the wrong version that had returned to us earlier. This thing was elongated, stretched like taffy with arms that were too long and fingers that ended in black claws. Its face was still recognizably Danny's, but the features were wrong. Eyes too wide, mouth too large, filled with those long, sharp teeth. Jake was nowhere to be seen. The Danny thing looked up at me as I emerged from my tent, and when it smiled, black blood dripped from between its teeth. "Michael," it said in Danny's voice, though the mouth didn't move right. "You're awake. Good. I was getting lonely." Sarah was still alive, I realized, still screaming, but there were long, parallel gashes down her arms and legs, and her eyes were rolled back in her head, showing only white. "Let her go," I said, though my voice came out as barely a whisper. "Let her go?" The thing laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass. "She's mine now, just like Jake was mine, just like you're going to be mine." "Where's Jake?" The Danny thing gestured with one impossibly long arm toward the lake. There, floating face down in the black water about 20 feet from shore, was Jake's body. Even from this distance I could see the gashes in his back, the way his arms floated at unnatural angles. "He tried to run," the thing said conversationally. "That was a mistake." Sarah's screaming had stopped. She was still breathing, but barely, and the blood pooling beneath her was spreading in the blue firelight. I ran, not toward the lake, not toward the forest, but into the only shelter available, my tent. I zipped it closed and crouched in the darkness trying to think of a plan, any plan that might save us. The thing that had been Danny didn't follow me immediately. Instead, I heard it moving around the campsite, making wet sounds that I didn't want to identify. Then it started talking to itself in Danny's voice, carrying on both sides of a conversation. "Where do you think he went?" "Probably in his tent." "Should we check?" "Let's wait, make him sweat a little." Then it laughed that glass-breaking laugh, and I realized it was playing with me. I felt around in the darkness for anything that might serve as a weapon. My phone was dead again, completely dead this time, the screen black and unresponsive. But I found my camping knife, a 4-inch blade that seemed pathetically small against what was waiting outside. The tent wall beside me suddenly bulged inward, as if something was pressing against it from outside. Then I heard scratching, long, slow scratches that moved from the bottom of the tent to the top. "Michael," the thing whispered so close to my ear that I could feel its breath through the thin tent fabric. "I know you're in there." I pressed myself against the opposite wall, knife clutched in my trembling hand. "I'm going to come in there with you," it continued. "And then we're going to play a game. Do you want to know what kind of game?" The scratching stopped. "I'm going to take you apart piece by piece," it said, "and I'm going to wear your skin like Danny's wearing his. And then we're going to wait for more campers to come visit our beautiful lake." The tent zipper started to move. I didn't wait for it to finish. I slashed at the back wall of the tent with my knife, cutting through the fabric in long strokes until I'd made a hole big enough to crawl through. Behind me, I could hear the zipper finishing its circuit and the thing squeezing into the tent. I rolled out through the hole and ran toward the lake, not because I had a plan, but because it was the only direction that led away from the thing pursuing me. My feet splashed into the shallow water at the lake's edge, and immediately I felt something wrap around my ankle. Jake's hand. He was floating face down, but his hand had somehow found my ankle and was gripping it with impossible strength. I looked down and saw that his eyes were open underwater, staring up at me with the same flat, emotionless expression that not Danny had worn. I kicked, frantically, trying to break free, but Jake's grip was like iron. More hands reached for me from the dark water. Sarah's hands, though I'd seen her bleeding out by the fire just moments before. She was floating just beneath the surface, her auburn hair spread around her head like seaweed, her eyes open and staring. The water was full of them now, bodies floating just beneath the surface, all reaching for me with pale, grasping hands. Some I recognized, other campers, hikers, people who had wandered into this cursed place and never left. Others were older, much older, their clothes rotted away and their skin gray and bloated, and all of them had that same flat, hungry expression. I managed to pull my ankle free from Jake's grip, but more hands immediately took its place. I was being pulled deeper into the lake, surrounded by floating corpses that seemed to move independently of any current. That's when I saw it. At the bottom of the lake, maybe 20 feet down in the black water, was a structure. Not a building, exactly, but something that might once have been a building before the water claimed it. It was made of what looked like bones, human bones, animal bones, all woven together into a framework that pulsed with its own sick light, and in the center of this bone structure something moved, something massive and ancient and hungry. The thing that had been wearing Danny's face was standing on the shore now, watching me struggle against the grasping hands. But it wasn't smiling anymore. Its expression was almost respectful. "She's been waiting so long," it called out to me. "Waiting for enough food to wake up properly. You and your friends, you're just the appetizers." The hands pulled me under. The water was thick and oily, tasting of rot and metal. I could see the other bodies floating around me, all slowly sinking toward the bone structure at the bottom. And I could see the thing in the center more clearly now. It was a woman, or had been once. Ancient beyond measure, her body twisted and elongated like the thing wearing Danny's face. But where Danny thing was merely wrong, this creature was impossibly vast, her limbs stretching out through the bone framework and into the lake itself. Her hair floated around her like tentacles, and when she opened her eyes, they were the same blue as our campfire. She smiled, and I saw that her mouth was full of the lake. When she spoke, water poured out between her teeth. "Welcome," she said, and her voice was the sound of drowning. "Welcome to my home." I was maybe 10 feet from her when I managed to break free from the grasping hands. I don't know how. Maybe they loosened their grip. Maybe they wanted me to get closer to their mistress. But suddenly I was swimming upward, my lungs burning, my vision starting to go black around the edges. I broke the surface just long enough to take one desperate breath before more hands pulled me back down. But in that moment, I saw something that gave me hope. Light. Real light, not the sick blue glow of our fire or the pulsing radiance from the bottom of the lake. Yellow light, warm and steady, coming from somewhere in the forest. A flashlight. Someone was coming. I fought against the hands with renewed strength, kicking and clawing my way back to the surface. The thing on shore was no longer watching me. It had turned toward the forest, toward the approaching light, and for the first time since this nightmare began, it looked worried. "No," it said, and its voice was no longer Danny's. It was something older, deeper, like wind through dead trees. "Not yet. She's not ready yet." But the light was getting closer, and I could hear voices. Human voices, calling out across the water. "Hello? Is someone out there? We heard screaming." The rescue team, it had to be a rescue team. Someone had noticed that we were overdue, had come looking for us. The creature that had been Danny made a sound like a wounded animal and dove into the lake. I felt the hands release me as their mistress called her servants back to the depths, and suddenly I was swimming freely toward shore. I pulled myself out of the water just as the first flashlight beam found me. 3 park rangers emerged from the forest, their powerful lights cutting through the darkness and revealing our campsite in all its horror. The blue fire was still burning, casting its cold light over Sarah's body by the fire ring. My tent was shredded where I'd cut my way out. And, floating just offshore, barely visible in the flashlight beams, were Jake and Sarah again, face down and motionless. "Jesus Christ," one of the rangers said. "What happened here?" I tried to explain, but the words came out in a jumbled rush that made no sense even to me. Camping trip, friends missing, something in the lake, not really my friends anymore, ancient thing at the bottom, time moving wrong, blue fire. They probably thought I was in shock, suffering from hypothermia and delirium after nearly drowning. They wrapped me in blankets and radioed for an evacuation helicopter while two of them waded into the lake to recover the bodies. But when they pulled Jake and Sarah from the water, they were just bodies. No grasping hands, no open eyes, no impossible strength. Just the corpses of my friends, killed by what the coroner would later rule as animal attack, species unknown. The helicopter took me to a hospital in Marshall, where I spent 3 days being treated for shock, dehydration, and what the doctors called survivor's guilt with dissociative episodes. They asked me over and over what had happened, how my friends had died, where Danny was. I told them different stories each time. Sometimes I said we'd been attacked by an alligator. Sometimes it was a bear, though there were no bears in that part of Texas. Once I said that Danny had killed Jake and Sarah before disappearing into the swamp, but the investigators found no evidence to support that theory. Danny's body was never found. The official report listed him as missing, presumed dead, possibly taken by the same animal that had killed the others. But I know the truth. The search team spent 2 weeks combing the area around Cado Lake. They found our abandoned SUV in the parking area just where we'd left it. They found our campsite, though they said the fire ring was cold and had clearly been unused for months. They found no trace of the blue flames, no rotted food, no shredded sleeping bags. According to their investigation, we'd been camping there for 3 days before the attack, not the single night I remembered. The timeline I'd lived through made no sense to them because time itself worked differently in that place. They found other things too, though these details were kept out of the official reports. Old campsites deep in the swamp, some of them decades old, still set up as if their occupants had simply vanished in the middle of ordinary activities. Personal belongings scattered throughout the area. Backpacks, tents, hiking boots, all in various stages of decay. And bones. Lots of bones, both human and animal, all showing the same strange scratches and bite marks that had killed my friends. The Park Service quietly closed that section of Cado Lake to public access. Not officially, there were no signs or announcements, but somehow people stopped going there. Rangers would find reasons to redirect hikers to other areas. Camping permits for the remote sites became mysteriously unavailable. I moved away from Texas 6 months later. Couldn't stand the thought of being anywhere near that place. But distance doesn't help when the nightmares come. In my dreams, I'm always back at that campsite, watching the blue flames dance in the fire ring, and in those dreams, I can see shapes moving in the darkness beyond the fire's reach. Danny's elongated form, Jake and Sarah floating just beneath the surface of the lake, and deeper down, much deeper, the ancient thing that wears human faces and feeds on human flesh. Sometimes I wake up with the taste of lake water in my mouth. 3 years have passed since the Cado Lake incident, as I've come to think of it. I've been through therapy, medication, everything the medical establishment has to offer for trauma-related disorders. My therapist says I'm making progress, that the nightmares are becoming less frequent, that I'm learning to separate reality from the delusions brought on by extreme stress. But last week, I received an email that changed everything. It was from someone named Jennifer Martinez, a park ranger in East Texas. She'd somehow tracked down my contact information through the old incident reports. Her message was brief. Mr. Williams, I know this might be difficult for you, but I need to ask about your experience at Cado Lake 3 years ago. We've had 3 more disappearances in the same area in the past month. All of them were experienced hikers who knew the area well. 2 of them were found floating in the lake, but the third is still missing. Before he disappeared, the missing man called his wife and told her he'd found an abandoned campsite with a fire that burned blue. I was hoping you might be willing to talk to me about what you remember. I think there's something out there that we need to find and stop. The email included her phone number and a request to call her as soon as possible. I stared at that email for 3 hours before I finally picked up the phone. Ranger Martinez? This is Michael Williams. I got your email. Mr. Williams, thank you for calling. I know this must be difficult. It's still there, isn't it? I interrupted. The thing in the lake, it's still there. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I think so," she said quietly, "and I think it's getting stronger. So now I'm writing this account, trying to get down every detail I can remember while it's still clear in my mind. Maybe someone will read this and understand what's really happening in that godforsaken swamp. Maybe someone will figure out how to stop it before it spreads beyond the confines of Cado Lake. Or maybe this is just the confession of a man who lost his mind in the East Texas wilderness and never quite found it again." I've agreed to meet with Ranger Martinez next week. Against every instinct for self-preservation I have left, I'm going to help her investigate the disappearances. Because if that thing is still down there, still feeding, still growing stronger, then someone has to stop it. And if that someone has to be me, the only person who's seen it and lived to tell about it, then so be it. I just hope that when I go back to Cado Lake, I come back as myself. If I come back at all. Found among the personal effects of Michael Williams after his disappearance during a joint investigation with Texas Parks and Wildlife Service, October 2028. Ranger Jennifer Martinez is also listed as missing. The remote access area of Cado Lake remains closed to the public. My name is James Anderson, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the dense pine forests of East Texas, near the Angelina National Forest, during what was supposed to be a peaceful 3-day camping trip with my German Shepherd, Rex. I should have known something was wrong the moment my GPS started glitching on Highway 63, but I blamed it on the thick canopy overhead. The device kept showing impossible routes, roads that curved back on themselves, destinations that appeared and vanished like mirages on the blue screen. By the time I reached the trailhead for Devil's Pocket Trail, a remote hiking path I'd discovered online, the GPS had given up entirely, displaying only a blank gray void where East Texas should have been. Rex whined from the passenger seat, his amber eyes fixed on something I couldn't see beyond the windshield. His ears were pinned back, and the fur along his spine stood rigid, behavior I'd never seen in my 5 years with him. German Shepherds are bred for courage, but Rex looked genuinely afraid. "What is it, boy?" I asked, scratching behind his ears. His skin felt unusually warm, almost feverish, but he wasn't panting. Instead, he continued staring into the forest with an intensity that made my stomach twist. The parking area was little more than a dirt clearing surrounded by towering loblolly pines. Their trunks disappeared into a canopy so thick that even at 2 in the afternoon, the forest floor existed in perpetual twilight. Spanish moss draped from the branches like funeral shrouds, and somewhere in the distance I could hear water moving, not the cheerful babble of a creek, but something deeper and more sluggish. I'd chosen this location specifically for its isolation. After my divorce 6 months earlier, I'd been seeking solitude, places where the only sounds were wind and wildlife. My ex-wife Sarah had kept our house in Dallas, our mutual friends, and most of our shared memories. All I'd walked away with was Rex and a crushing need to be anywhere but surrounded by the ghosts of my former life. The trail markers were hand-carved wooden posts, weathered gray and split with age. Some bore barely legible warnings. "Dangerous terrain ahead," and "Hike at your own risk." One post, about 50 yards into the forest, had been scratched and clawed by something with very large talons. The gouges were deep, too deep for any bird I knew of, and arranged in parallel sets of 4. Rex refused to walk past that post. He planted his feet and pulled backward on his leash, whimpering. When I tried to coax him forward with treats, he backed away from me for the first time in his life, his eyes never leaving mine but somehow looking through me, as if I'd become transparent. "Come on, Rex, it's just woods." But even as I said it, I felt the wrongness settling around us like a weight. The air smelled of stagnant water and something else, something organic and putrid that reminded me of the time a possum had died in my attic and gone unnoticed for weeks. I unclipped his leash, thinking he'd follow once free to explore at his own pace. Instead, Rex bolted back toward the car, disappearing around a bend in the trail. I called after him, but the forest seemed to swallow my voice, muffling the sound until it felt like shouting underwater. That should have been my cue to leave. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to turn around, collect my dog, and drive back to Dallas. But pride and stubbornness kept me moving forward. I'd driven 3 hours to get here, taken time off work, and spent money on camping gear I'd barely used since college. I wasn't going to let some atmospheric weirdness and a spooked dog ruin my plans. The trail wound deeper into the forest, following what might have once been a logging road. Ruts from old truck tires were still visible in the packed earth, now filled with stagnant rainwater that reflected the sky in fractured, oil-slick rainbows. Pine needles carpeted everything, muffling my footsteps until I moved in unnatural silence. About 2 miles in, I encountered the first of the others. A woman emerged from behind a massive pine trunk, startling me so badly that I dropped my backpack. She was maybe 40, with short brown hair and the lean build of an experienced hiker. Her gear looked expensive. REI everything, the kind of setup that cost more than my monthly rent. "Jesus, you scared me," I said, pressing a hand to my chest. "I didn't hear you coming." She smiled, but something about the expression felt rehearsed, like she was remembering how smiling was supposed to work. "Sorry about that. These woods are so quiet, aren't they? Almost too quiet." Now that she mentioned it, I realized I hadn't heard a single bird call since leaving the parking area. No insects buzzing, no squirrels chattering in the trees. The forest around us was as silent as a tomb. "I'm Amanda," she said, extending a hand. Her grip was cold and oddly firm, her skin rough like sandpaper. "Amanda Parker, you heading to Devil's Pocket?" "James Anderson, and yeah, though I'm starting to think the name is more literal than I hoped." I tried to laugh, but the sound came out hollow. "Oh, it is." Her smile widened, showing teeth that seemed too white, too sharp. "But don't worry. Once you get there, you'll never want to leave." The way she said it made ice form in my stomach, but before I could ask what she meant, Amanda had melted back into the forest with impossible silence. I called after her, but she was gone, leaving only the faint smell of decay in the air. I found my campsite as the sun began its descent toward the tree line. Devil's Pocket was a small clearing beside a dark pool of water that might charitably be called a pond. The water was black as crude oil and perfectly still, reflecting nothing despite the sky visible overhead. Massive cypress trees rose from its depths, their knees breaking the surface like the bones of some primordial skeleton. The recommended camping area was a patch of relatively flat ground about 20 yards from the water's edge. I set up my tent quickly, eager to have some kind of shelter before full darkness fell. The temperature was dropping faster than it should have, and mist was beginning to rise from the pond surface. By the time I had my camp established, I was genuinely worried about Rex. He'd never run from me before, never failed to respond to my calls. I tried whistling, the sharp sound that usually brought him running from any distance, but the forest absorbed even that, leaving only oppressive silence. I built a fire as darkness settled over Devil's Pocket, grateful for the warmth and light. The flames danced normally at first, casting familiar orange shadows on the surrounding trees. But as full night descended, the fire began to burn strange colors, blue and green flames that flickered without wind, creating shadows that moved independently of the light source. That's when I heard the first whisper. It came from somewhere behind me, soft and sibilant, like wind through leaves. But there was no wind. The air was perfectly still, almost stifling in its weight. I turned toward the sound, peering into the darkness beyond my fire's reach, but saw nothing. The whisper came again, closer this time, and I could almost make out words. It sounded like my name, but distorted, stretched thin like taffy. Jams. Jams. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the tree line, the beam revealing nothing but pine trunks and hanging moss. But when I lowered the light, I caught a glimpse of something pale moving between the trees, something that walked upright but moved wrong, with joints that bent in directions joints shouldn't bend. "Hello," I called out, my voice cracking slightly. "Amanda, is that you?" The whisper came from directly behind me this time. I spun around so fast I nearly fell into the fire, but nothing was there except my tent and the black water beyond. The pond's surface rippled slightly, as if something large had just disappeared beneath it. I didn't sleep that first night. I sat by the fire, feeding it constantly, watching the flames shift between normal orange and that unnatural blue-green. Every few minutes I heard my name whispered from different directions, sometimes from multiple voices at once. Once, I could have sworn I heard Rex barking somewhere in the distance, but when I called back, the sound stopped abruptly, cut off mid-bark like someone had shut a door. Dawn brought little relief. The sun seemed to struggle through the canopy, casting the clearing in a sickly yellow light that made everything look jaundiced. The fire had burned down to cold ashes despite my efforts to keep it going, and the wood I'd gathered the night before was now damp and rotting, as if weeks had passed instead of hours. My watch had stopped at 3:17 a.m., though I distinctly remembered checking it around 6 and seeing 6:43. When I tried to turn it on, the digital display showed only random symbols, hieroglyphs or runes that hurt to look at directly. I was packing up my campsite, ready to hike back to the car and leave this cursed place, when Rex appeared. He emerged from the forest on the far side of the pond, moving with his familiar confident gait. Relief flooded through me so intensely that I actually felt dizzy. I called his name and started around the water toward him, but something made me stop halfway. Rex wasn't responding to my voice. He was staring at me with those amber eyes, but there was no recognition in them, no joy at seeing me after our night apart. His tail wasn't wagging. His ears weren't perked forward. He simply stood there, watching me with the patient stillness of a predator. "Rex, come here, boy." He tilted his head and I noticed something wrong with the movement. It was too far, too sharp, like his neck had extra vertebrae. When he opened his mouth, his tongue lolled out, but it was too long, too dark, almost black in the yellow morning light. The thing that looked like Rex began walking toward me, circling the pond with measured steps. Its paws made no sound on the forest floor. It never blinked, never broke eye contact, and with each step, I became more certain that whatever was approaching me, it wasn't my dog. I backed toward my tent, trying to keep the fire pit between us. "Stay back," I said, hating how my voice shook. "I don't know what you are, but stay the hell back." The Rex thing paused at the edge of my campsite and sat, perfectly still, perfectly silent. Then it spoke. "James." The voice was Rex's bark but shaped into human speech, guttural and wrong. "James, why did you leave me?" I ran. I crashed through the forest without regard for the trail, branches tearing at my clothes and face. Behind me, I could hear the thing that looked like Rex following, but it wasn't running. It was walking with that same measured pace, and somehow it was keeping up. Every time I glanced back, it was the same distance away, watching me with those empty amber eyes. The trees seemed to shift around me as I ran, paths appearing and disappearing, familiar landmarks rearranging themselves into new configurations. I passed the scratched post 3 times, each time from a different direction, as if the forest was folding in on itself. I finally collapsed against a massive oak tree, gasping for breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. The Rex thing was nowhere to be seen, but I didn't trust the apparent safety. Nothing in this place was what it seemed. That's when I heard voices ahead of me. Human voices, thank God. I stumbled toward the sound and found a small group of hikers setting up camp in a clearing I didn't remember seeing before. There were 4 of them, 2 men and 2 women, all around my age with the easy camaraderie of old friends. "Hey there," one of the men called out when he saw me. "You look like you've seen a ghost." If only it were that simple. "I'm lost," I said, which wasn't exactly a lie. "My dog ran off and I've been trying to find him." "In these woods." The speaker was a tall man with prematurely gray hair and laugh lines around his eyes. "Good luck with that. This place eats things. dogs, hikers, common sense." He chuckled, but there was an edge to it. "Don't listen to him," said one of the women, a blonde with a kind face. "I'm Katie. This is my husband Mark, and that's Jennifer and Rob. We've been coming here for years. The forest can be disorienting, but it's not dangerous if you know what you're doing." But even as she spoke, I noticed things that made my skin crawl. None of them cast shadows despite the morning sun. Their campfire was burning those same blue-green flames I'd seen the night before. And when they moved, it was with that same subtle wrongness I'd seen in the Rex thing, joints that bent slightly incorrectly, movements that were almost but not quite human. "Why don't you join us for breakfast?" Mark suggested. "You look like you could use some coffee." The smell hit me then. That same organic decay I'd been smelling since entering the forest, but stronger now, emanating from their campsite. It was the smell of meat left too long in the sun, of flowers rotting in stagnant water. "That's okay," I said, backing away slowly. "I should keep looking for my dog." "Oh, but we've seen your dog," Jennifer said, her smile too wide. "He's right behind you." I turned and saw Rex, or the thing wearing Rex's shape, standing at the edge of the clearing. It sat and tilted its head at that impossible angle, watching me with those dead amber eyes. "Rex has been telling us all about you, James," Rob said, "about how lonely you've been since Sarah left, about how you came here looking for peace but found something else entirely." The four campers began walking toward me, their movements synchronized like dancers who'd rehearsed the steps 1,000 times. Their faces were still human, still friendly, but their eyes were empty black holes that seemed to pull light into them. "The forest is hungry, James," Katie said, her voice echoing strangely. "It's been so long since we've had fresh meat." I ran again, crashing through the underbrush with the desperate strength of pure terror. Behind me I could hear them laughing. Not human laughter, but something that sounded like wind through broken glass. The trees pressed closer as I fled, their branches reaching for me like gnarled fingers. Twice I fell, tearing my hands on hidden roots and rocks. My backpack snagged on a low branch and tore free, spilling my supplies across the forest floor. But I didn't stop to retrieve anything. I don't know how long I ran or how far. Time seemed elastic in that place, stretching and compressing without logic. The sun moved overhead in stuttering jerks, sometimes racing across the sky, sometimes hanging motionless for what felt like hours. Eventually, I found myself back at the parking area, though I had no memory of following any trail. My car sat exactly where I'd left it, looking impossibly normal amid all the wrongness. I fumbled for my keys with shaking hands, expecting at any moment to hear Rex's distorted voice calling my name, or to see those empty-eyed campers emerging from the tree line. The engine turned over on the first try, and I'd never heard a more beautiful sound. I threw the car into reverse and backed out of that clearing like the devil himself was chasing me. It wasn't until I was back on Highway 63, putting miles between myself and Devil's Pocket, that I realized what was sitting in my passenger seat. Rex sat there calmly, his amber eyes fixed on the road ahead. He looked perfectly normal, no wrong angles, no impossible neck movements. Just my dog, as if nothing had happened. "Rex?" I said tentatively. He turned to look at me, and for a moment his eyes seemed to reflect light that wasn't there. Then he wagged his tail once and made a soft whuffing sound, the same sound he'd always made when he was content. But he didn't feel content. He felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate, like a perfectly crafted replica of something beloved. His fur felt different under my hand when I reached over to pet him, coarser with an oily quality that made my skin crawl. His breathing was too regular, too measured, like someone consciously remembering to breathe. And he was cold. Not cool from the morning air, but cold like something that had been dead for hours. I should have stopped the car, should have left him by the roadside and driven away. But he was still Rex, at least in appearance, and I couldn't bring myself to abandon him, even if something fundamental had changed. Even if he was no longer entirely my dog, he was all I had left. We drove back to Dallas in silence. Rex never moved from his position, never asked to stop for water or to relieve himself, never showed any of the normal signs of a dog on a long car ride. He simply sat and stared ahead with those two bright eyes, occasionally turning to look at me with an expression I couldn't read. That was 3 weeks ago. Rex still lives with me, still sleeps at the foot of my bed, still goes through the motions of being a dog, but he doesn't eat the food I put out for him. I find the bowl empty each morning, but I never see him touch it. He doesn't chase squirrels or bark at the mailman. He doesn't play with his toys or show excitement when I come home from work. He watches me instead, constantly, with an intelligence that's far too human and far too hungry. And sometimes, late at night, I hear him whisper my name in that same distorted voice I heard in the forest. J. Yams. J. Ames. He forms the words without moving his mouth, the sound seeming to come from inside his throat, from somewhere deep and dark that shouldn't exist in a dog's anatomy. I've tried to research Devil's Pocket, to find some explanation for what happened there, but every search comes up empty. According to official records, there is no Devil's Pocket Trail in East Texas. The Angelina National Forest has no such designation. The road I drove down, the parking area, the trail markers, none of it exists on any map. But I have the scratches on my arms from the branches. I have the memories burned into my brain. And I have Rex sitting in the corner of my living room as I write this, watching me with those amber eyes that sometimes reflect light from sources that aren't there. The worst part is that I'm starting to change too. My reflection in the mirror looks slightly wrong lately. Not dramatically, just small things that accumulate into something unsettling. My smile is too wide. My eyes don't quite track together the way they should. And sometimes, when I'm not thinking about it, I catch myself moving with that same careful, measured pace I saw in the forest. I think the thing that came back wearing Rex's shape is teaching me how to be like them, how to move, how to speak, how to pretend to be human while something else looks out through my eyes. The hunger is starting too. Not for food, I can barely eat normal meals anymore, but for something else, something warm and living and afraid. I found myself following a jogger through my neighborhood yesterday, keeping just out of sight, savoring the sound of her breathing and the rhythm of her heartbeat. When she stopped to tie her shoe, I had to clench my fists to keep from reaching out to touch her, to see if her skin felt as warm as it looked. I know what's happening to me. I know what I'm becoming. But I can't seem to stop it, and part of me doesn't want to. The hunger grows stronger each day, and with it comes a terrible understanding of what those things in the forest really were. People like me who'd gone looking for solitude and found something that was looking right back. Sometimes I catch myself researching hiking trails, remote camping spots, places where people go to be alone with nature, places where someone might disappear for days before anyone started looking for them. The websites bookmark themselves in my browser, and I find myself planning trips I never consciously decided to take. Rex approves of these plans. I can tell by the way his tail wags when I'm looking at maps, by the soft whuffing sounds he makes when I mark potential campsites. He's eager to return to the forest, to bring others back to the place where we found each other. Because that's what Devil's Pocket really is. Not a location, but a state of being. A hunger that wears familiar faces and speaks in beloved voices. It doesn't need a place on any map because it exists wherever people like us go, wherever someone is lonely enough and desperate enough to ignore the warning signs. I'm writing this down because I want there to be some record, some explanation for what's coming. Tomorrow, Rex and I are driving back to East Texas, to a different trail this time, one where a family is supposed to be camping for the weekend. I found their blog post online, complete with photos of their 2 young children and detailed information about their planned route. They look so happy in those photos, so full of life and warmth and everything I used to be. I can almost taste how sweet that warmth will be when I drain it away, how quiet and still they'll become once they understand what they're really camping with. My name is James Anderson, and I am 34 years old. This is what happened to me in the forests of East Texas, and this is what I've become because of it. If you're reading this, if you found this account somehow, then you probably already know what you need to do. Stay away from the wilderness. Stay away from remote trails and isolated camping spots. And if you ever encounter someone who seems just a little bit wrong, someone whose smile is too wide or whose eyes reflect light that isn't there, don't trust your need for human connection. Run, because we're always hungry and we're very, very good at pretending to be human. Rex just lifted his head and looked toward the door. Someone's coming up the walkway. Probably the mailman, though it's awfully late for mail delivery. Rex's tail is wagging now, and I can smell that familiar scent of fear and confusion that means fresh prey. I should probably go answer the door. After all, it's only polite to greet visitors properly, and we have so much to teach them about what it means to be alone in the dark. My name is Sarah Rodriguez, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the deep woods of East Texas, in a place where the trees grow so thick they swallow the light whole, where the Spanish moss hangs like funeral shrouds, and where something ancient and hungry still walks between the pines. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip. Jessica, Amanda, and I had been planning it for months. 3 old college friends trying to reconnect after years of letting life pull us in different directions. Jessica had found the spot online, some remote area in the Big Thicket National Preserve, miles from any established campground. Off the beaten path, she'd called it, her green eyes bright with excitement as she showed us the satellite images on her laptop. Just us, nature, and no cell service to distract us. Amanda had laughed, tucking a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. Sounds perfect. I need to get away from everything for a while. She'd been going through a messy divorce, and the stress had carved new lines around her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. I should have paid more attention to those satellite images. Should have noticed how the trees seemed to form an almost perfect circle around the clearing Jessica had marked. Should have questioned why such a pristine camping spot remained unmarked on any official park map. We drove down from Dallas on a Friday morning in October, when the Texas heat had finally begun to loosen its stranglehold and the air carried hints of something cooler. The drive took us deeper and deeper into East Texas, past small towns that seemed frozen in time, past rusted mailboxes standing guard over long dirt driveways that disappeared into walls of pine and oak. "Turn left at the old church," Jessica read from her handwritten directions, squinting through the windshield of my Jeep. The church turned out to be a weathered white building with a crooked steeple, its windows boarded up and its parking lot overrun with weeds. A sign hung askew from its post. Redemption Baptist Church, Est, 1894, services suspended. "Cheerful," Amanda muttered from the back seat, but she was smiling. We were all in good spirits then, looking forward to 3 days of hiking, campfires, and the kind of deep conversations that only happened when you stripped away the noise of daily life. The dirt road beyond the church narrowed with each mile, tree branches scraping against the sides of my Jeep like gnarled fingers trying to hold us back. My GPS signal had cut out completely about 10 miles back, and now even Jessica's usually reliable sense of direction seemed to be wavering. "Are you sure this is right?" I asked, navigating around a particularly deep pothole that could have swallowed a small car. "The directions say to keep going until we see the Twin Oaks," Jessica replied, but there was a note of uncertainty in her voice that hadn't been there before. We found the Twin Oaks just as the sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon. 2 massive trees whose trunks had grown together at the base, creating a natural archway over what could generously be called a trail. Jessica whooped with relief as we pulled up beside them. "See? I told you I knew where I was going." The trail beyond the oaks was barely wide enough for the Jeep, and branches scraped continuously against the windshield as we crawled forward at walking speed. After what felt like an hour but was probably only 20 minutes, the trees finally opened up into a clearing perhaps 50 yards across. It was beautiful, I had to admit. The clearing was surrounded by towering pines that must have been centuries old, their tops disappearing into the darkening sky. A small creek gurgled along the eastern edge, and the ground was carpeted with soft pine needles that would make for comfortable sleeping. But there was something about the place that made my skin crawl, some indefinable quality that had nothing to do with the gathering darkness. The silence was too complete. No bird songs, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, no insect sounds except for the distant whine of mosquitoes. Even the wind seemed to die as it reached the edges of the clearing, as if the trees were holding their breath. "This is perfect," Jessica said, hopping out of the Jeep and stretching her arms above her head. "Look at all this space, and that creek means fresh water." Amanda was already unloading our gear, her earlier melancholy replaced by genuine enthusiasm. "We should set up the tents before it gets completely dark." I shook off my unease and helped them unpack. By the time we had our 3 tents arranged in a triangle around what would be our fire pit, full darkness had fallen like a heavy curtain. The silence I'd noticed earlier had deepened, broken only by our own voices and the crackle of Amanda's fire starter as she tried to get our campfire going. "Come on," she muttered, clicking the starter again and again. The sparks caught the kindling, flared bright for a moment, then died. "This should be working." "Let me try," Jessica offered, but her attempts met with the same failure. The kindling would catch, burn for a few seconds, then sputter out as if something was smothering the flames. "Maybe the wood is too green," I suggested, though the pine needles and small branches we'd gathered seemed dry enough. "Or maybe the fire spirits don't want us here," Amanda joked, but her laugh sounded forced in the oppressive silence. We finally managed to get a small fire going using nearly half our fire starter, but the flames burned lower and dimmer than they should have, casting strange, wavering shadows that seemed to move independently of the flickering light. The 3 of us huddled close to the weak fire, our conversation subdued by the weight of the darkness pressing in around us. "Did either of you notice how quiet it is out here?" I asked, voicing what we were all thinking. "It's probably just because we're so far from civilization," Jessica said, but she moved her camping chair closer to the fire as she spoke. "No traffic noise, no neighbors' TVs, pure wilderness." "I love it," Amanda declared, though she kept glancing over her shoulder at the wall of trees surrounding us. "When's the last time any of us experienced real darkness? The kind where you can't see your hand in front of your face?" As if in response to her words, our fire suddenly dimmed further, the flames dropping to barely 6 inches high despite the steady supply of fuel we'd been feeding it. "That's weird," Jessica murmured, poking at the logs with a stick. The wood was burning normally underneath, glowing red-hot, but the flames themselves seemed reluctant to rise. "Must be the humidity," I said, trying to convince myself as much as them. "All this moisture in the air from the creek." But the air didn't feel humid. If anything, it felt unnaturally dry, almost brittle, as if the forest was holding its breath. We talked for another hour or so, sharing stories and catching up on each other's lives, but the conversation felt strained. Every few minutes, one of us would pause mid-sentence, tilting our heads to listen to some sound that might have been the wind through the trees or might have been something else entirely. "I keep feeling like something's watching us," Amanda finally admitted, wrapping her jacket more tightly around herself. "It's just the darkness playing tricks on your mind," Jessica said, but I noticed she'd moved her chair so her back was to the fire and she was facing the tree line. "Maybe we should turn in," I suggested. "We've got a long day of hiking planned tomorrow." The others agreed quickly, perhaps too quickly. We doused the fire with water from the creek, and the darkness that rushed in to replace the feeble light was so complete it felt solid, like being buried alive. My tent was the closest to the tree line, and as I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the others settling in for the night, I became aware of sounds just beyond the wall of canvas. Soft rustling that might have been wind through leaves, except there was no wind. Gentle footsteps that could have been animals foraging, except they seemed too measured, too deliberate. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the isolation and darkness were making me jumpy. But as the night wore on, the sounds grew closer and more distinct. Twigs snapping just outside my tent, the soft whisper of something brushing against the canvas, At one point, I could have sworn I heard breathing. Slow, deliberate breaths that didn't match the rhythm of my own, or the soft snores coming from Amanda's tent. I must have finally dozed off sometime after midnight, because I was jolted awake by Amanda screaming, "Jessica! Jessica, where are you?" I fumbled for my flashlight and unzipped my tent, stumbling out into air so cold it made my breath visible in white puffs. Amanda was standing in the center of the clearing, her flashlight beam dancing wildly as she spun in circles. "What's wrong?" I called, running toward her. "Jessica's gone," Amanda panted, her face white with panic in the harsh LED light. "Her tent! Look at her tent!" I turned my flashlight toward Jessica's tent and felt my stomach drop. The tent was intact, but the zipper was open from the inside, the flaps spread wide as if she had simply walked out. Her sleeping bag lay twisted and empty, still warm to the touch when I reached inside to check. "Maybe she just went to use the bathroom," I said, though even as the words left my mouth I knew they sounded hollow. We'd all agreed to stay close to camp during the night, and Jessica wouldn't have wandered off without waking one of us. "Jessica!" Amanda called, her voice cracking. "Jessica!" Her shouts echoed briefly off the surrounding trees, then were swallowed by the oppressive silence. No response came back. We spent the next 2 hours searching the perimeter of the clearing, calling Jessica's name and sweeping our flashlight beams through the maze of tree trunks. But the forest seemed to absorb our light the same way it had absorbed Amanda's calls, and we found no trace of our friend, no footprints in the soft earth, no broken branches to indicate which direction she might have gone. "We should hike back to the car and drive until we get cell service," Amanda said when we finally returned to camp, exhausted and no closer to finding Jessica. "We need to call for help." "What if she comes back while we're gone?" I asked. "What if she's lost out there and manages to find her way back to camp?" The question hung between us like a physical weight. Neither option seemed right, leaving Jessica alone if she returned, or staying here helplessly while she might be wandering deeper into the wilderness with each passing hour. "We'll leave a note," Amanda decided. "Tell her we've gone for help and to stay put if she comes back." But as we prepared to break camp, Amanda's flashlight began to flicker and dim. Then mine did the same. Both lights had been fully charged before the trip, but now they were dying, as if the batteries were being drained by some unseen force. "This can't be happening," Amanda whispered, shaking her flashlight frantically. "These are brand new batteries." In the distance, just at the edge of hearing, I thought I heard something that made my blood turn to ice. A voice calling my name. Soft at first, barely audible above the whisper of wind through pine needles, but growing gradually closer. "Sarah. Sarah! Do you hear that?" I grabbed Amanda's arm. She nodded, her eyes wide with terror. "That's not Jessica. That doesn't sound like Jessica." The voice was wrong somehow, the right pitch and tone, but with an odd, hollow quality, like an echo of an echo. It was calling from somewhere deep in the trees, moving in a slow circle around our campsite. "Sarah, Amanda, where are you?" "Jessica," Amanda called tentatively. "Is that you? We've been looking for you." The voice stopped abruptly, and for a moment the forest returned to its unnatural silence. Then it started again, closer this time, just beyond the tree line. "I got lost," the voice said, and now it sounded exactly like Jessica. Same inflection, same slight Texas drawl. "I'm sorry, I got confused in the dark. Can you help me find my way back?" Relief flooded through me so powerfully that my knees nearly buckled. Thank God. "Jessica, follow the sound of our voices. We're right here in the clearing." "I can't see your lights," the voice replied, and I realized with a chill that Jessica was right. Our flashlights had died completely, leaving us in absolute darkness. "Hold on," Amanda called. "We'll get the fire going again." But when we knelt beside the fire pit and tried to relight the ashes, nothing happened. Our lighter clicked uselessly, producing sparks that seemed to die before they could catch anything. "The fire won't start," I called into the darkness. "Just keep following our voices. You're almost here." There was no response for a long moment. Then, from a completely different direction came Jessica's voice again. "Sarah, Amanda, I can't find you. Everything looks the same out here." My blood turned to ice water. The voice was coming from the opposite side of the clearing now, at least 100 yards from where it had been just moments before. Either Jessica was running through the forest at inhuman speed, or— "That's impossible," Amanda whispered beside me. "She couldn't have moved that fast through the trees. Not in this darkness." "Jessica," I called, my voice shaking. "Stay where you are. Don't move. We're coming to get you." But even as I said it, I heard the voice again, now coming from a third direction. "I'm here. I'm right here. Why can't you see me?" Amanda grabbed my arm so tightly her fingernails drew blood. "Sarah, there's something wrong. That's not Jessica. That can't be Jessica." The voice began to multiply, coming from all around us now. The same plea repeated from multiple points in the forest, as if a dozen Jessicas were calling for help simultaneously. Some of the voices were slightly off-pitch, others had an odd echo, and one sounded as if it was coming from underwater. "I'm here. I'm here. Why can't you see me? I'm right here." The cacophony grew louder and more discordant until it felt like the trees themselves were screaming. Then, abruptly, everything went silent. Amanda and I huddled together in the center of the clearing, afraid to move or speak. Minutes passed like hours. Just as I was beginning to think the nightmare was over, I heard footsteps in the soft pine needles at the edge of the clearing. Slow, measured steps that definitely belonged to a human. "Sarah? Amanda?" This voice was different from the others. Quieter, more hesitant, absolutely perfect in its mimicry of Jessica's speech patterns. "I found my way back. I can see your camp." A figure emerged from the tree line, and in the faint starlight filtering through the canopy, I could just make out the familiar silhouette of my friend. She was wearing the same clothes she'd had on when we went to sleep, jeans and a University of Texas sweatshirt. Her blonde hair caught what little light there was. "Jessica!" Amanda cried, running toward her. But something made me hold back. Maybe it was the way Jessica was walking. Too smooth, too fluid, as if she was gliding rather than stepping. Maybe it was the way she held her head, tilted at an angle that didn't look quite natural. Or maybe it was simply the memory of those multiple voices calling from the forest. "Where were you?" Amanda was saying, embracing the figure. "We've been so worried. We looked everywhere." "I got turned around," Jessica replied, and her voice was exactly right now. No echo, no distortion. "I went to use the bathroom and couldn't find my way back in the dark. I've been wandering for hours." "Your flashlight," I said, stepping closer but maintaining some distance. "What happened to your flashlight?" Jessica turned to look at me, and in the dim starlight I caught a glimpse of her eyes. They reflected the light like an animal's, a pale, silvery shine that was completely wrong. "Batteries died," she said simply, "just like yours did." But that was impossible. Jessica's flashlight had been in her tent when we'd searched it. If she'd had it with her when she left, we would have seen the light through the trees. "We should get some sleep," Jessica continued. "Big day of hiking tomorrow." She walked past me toward her tent, and as she did, I caught her scent, or rather, the complete absence of scent. No perfume, no soap, no natural human odor. It was as if she had no smell at all, like she was made of air and shadow. "Jessica," I called softly, "are you okay? You seem different." She turned back to me, and this time I was sure I saw that silvery reflection in her eyes. "I'm fine, Sarah. Just tired. It's been a long night." She disappeared into her tent, zipping it closed from the inside with the same deliberate precision she'd always used. Within minutes, I could hear the soft, regular breathing of sleep coming from inside. Amanda and I retreated to our own tents, but sleep was impossible. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the canvas ceiling and listening to the sounds of the night. Every few minutes I heard movement from Jessica's tent, the rustle of fabric, the creak of someone shifting position. But the sounds were wrong somehow, too frequent and too rhythmic, as if whatever was in there was restless in a way that Jessica never was. Worse than the sounds, though, was the smell that had begun to seep through the walls of my tent sometime around dawn. It was subtle at first, easy to dismiss as the natural decomposition of fallen leaves and forest debris. But as the night wore on, it grew stronger and more distinct, the sickly, sweet odor of meat beginning to rot. When the first gray light of dawn finally began to filter through the trees, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The clearing looked different in the pale morning light, somehow smaller and more confined. The trees seemed to have moved closer during the night, their shadows reaching toward our camp like grasping fingers. Amanda emerged from her tent at almost the same moment, her hair disheveled and her face drawn with exhaustion. "Did you sleep at all?" she whispered. I shook my head. "You?" "Couldn't. There were sounds all night. And that smell." She wrinkled her nose. "Do you smell that?" The odor was stronger now, definitely coming from the direction of Jessica's tent. It was the unmistakable smell of decay, of something that had been dead for days in the heat. "We need to check on her," I said, though every instinct I had was screaming at me to run. We approached Jessica's tent together, calling her name softly at first, then more loudly when she didn't respond. The smell grew overpowering as we got closer, making my eyes water and my stomach churn. "Jessica?" Amanda called, reaching for the zipper. "We're coming in." She unzipped the tent flap and immediately stumbled backward, gagging. The smell that poured out was so intense it was like a physical blow, the concentrated essence of death and corruption. Inside the tent, Jessica's sleeping bag was twisted and torn, as if something had thrashed violently inside it. Dark stains soaked the fabric, stains that looked suspiciously like blood in the morning light. But Jessica herself was nowhere to be seen. "Where is she?" Amanda gasped, covering her nose and mouth with her shirt. "She was right here. We heard her breathing." But as I forced myself to look more closely at the scene inside the tent, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The sleeping bag had been torn from the inside, just like the first time Jessica had disappeared, and scattered around the interior of the tent were things that shouldn't have been there. Small bones that looked disturbingly like finger bones, scraps of fabric that might once have been clothing, and other things I didn't want to examine too closely. "We need to leave," I said, backing away from the tent. "Right now. We need to get to the car and get out of here." Amanda nodded frantically, her face green with nausea. We threw our belongings into our packs with no regard for organization, concerned only with speed. I was shoving my sleeping bag into its compression sack when I heard Amanda scream. I spun around to see Jessica standing at the edge of the clearing, watching us with those strange reflective eyes. She was wearing the same clothes as the night before, but now they were torn and stained with dark patches that looked like dried blood. "Where are you going?" she asked, and her voice had that hollow, echoing quality again. "I thought we were going hiking today." "Jessica," I said carefully, my hand inching toward the bear spray on my belt. "Where were you just now? We looked in your tent and you weren't there." "I went for a walk," she replied, tilting her head to that unnatural angle again. "I wanted to see the sunrise through the trees, but the sun was barely visible through the heavy canopy, and I could see no evidence that Jessica had been walking through the forest. Her clothes showed no sign of contact with branches or undergrowth, and there wasn't a single pine needle or burr clinging to her hair." "What happened to your tent?" Amanda asked, her voice shaking. "There's blood everywhere." Jessica looked genuinely puzzled. "Blood? I don't know what you mean." She started walking toward us, and with each step, that rotting smell grew stronger. Up close, I could see that her skin had an odd, waxy quality, as if she were a mannequin rather than a living person. Dark veins were visible beneath the surface, branching out like roots from her eyes and mouth. "Jessica, stop," I said, raising the bear spray. "Don't come any closer." She paused, tilting her head like a confused animal. "Why are you afraid of me, Sarah?" "I'm your friend." "No," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "You're not Jessica." I don't know what you are, but you're not my friend." The thing wearing Jessica's face smiled then, and when it did, I saw that its teeth were wrong. Too sharp, too numerous, arranged in rows like a shark's. Dark fluid leaked from the corners of its mouth. "I'm exactly who I've always been," it said, but now multiple voices were coming from its throat, layered over each other in a nauseating harmony. Some were Jessica's voice at different ages, the way she'd sounded in college, in high school, as a child. Others were voices I didn't recognize, male and female, young and old, all speaking in unison. "We are who we've always been," the chorus continued. "We are everyone who has walked in these woods, everyone who has joined us in the dark between the trees." Amanda was hyperventilating beside me, but she managed to pull out her own can of bear spray. "What did you do to Jessica?" she demanded. "Where is our friend?" The thing's smile widened, showing more of those terrible teeth. "She's here. She's part of us now, just like you will be." It took a step forward, and I triggered the bear spray. The orange stream hit it directly in the face, but instead of crying out in pain or stumbling backward, it just stood there, letting the chemical wash over it without any apparent effect. "That won't help you," it said, wiping the spray from its eyes with movements that were too quick and too fluid. "Nothing you brought with you will help you here." Amanda and I ran. We crashed through the undergrowth toward where we'd left the jeep, branches tearing at our clothes and faces. Behind us, I could hear the thing that had been Jessica following, but it wasn't running. It was walking at that same measured pace, as if it knew we couldn't escape. The trees seemed to close in around us as we fled, creating a maze where none had existed before. Paths I was certain we'd walked down the day before had vanished, replaced by impenetrable walls of thorns and fallen logs. The canopy above grew thicker and darker, blocking out more and more of the weak morning light. "The car!" Amanda panted beside me. "Where's the car? It should be right here." But the twin oaks that had marked our trail were nowhere to be seen. In every direction the forest stretched on endlessly, identical stands of pine and oak that offered no landmarks or guidance. "We're lost," I said, the words feeling like stones in my mouth. "The forest, it's changed. Nothing looks the same." Behind us I could still hear that measured walking, occasionally punctuated by voices calling our names. Not just Jessica's voice now, but others as well. Men and women, children, elderly voices all layered together in an impossibly complex chorus. "Sarah, Amanda, don't run from us. We just want to talk. We want to be friends." The voices were coming from multiple directions now, surrounding us. I realized with growing horror that we weren't just being followed by one entity. There were others in the forest, other things that had once been people who had walked into these woods and never walked out. "This way," Amanda whispered, pointing toward what looked like a break in the trees. "I think I see daylight." We pushed through a curtain of hanging moss and emerged into another clearing, this one smaller than our campsite and dominated by something that made my blood freeze in my veins. In the center of the clearing stood what might once have been a tree, but had been twisted and shaped into something that resembled a massive totem pole. Human bones were woven through its bark, ribs and femurs, skulls and scattered vertebrae, all fused with the living wood as if they had grown there. Some of the bones were old and yellowed with age, while others were fresh enough that scraps of clothing and hair still clung to them. At the base of the tree, arranged in a careful circle, were items that told the story of all those who had come before us. Backpacks and camping gear from dozens of different eras. Canvas packs that looked like they dated from the 1940s. Modern synthetic gear that could have been from last year. Military surplus from various decades. All of it was stained and torn, left behind by people who no longer had need of earthly possessions. "Oh, God," Amanda whispered. "How many people has this place taken?" The answer came in the form of that horrible chorus rising from the trees around us. Dozens of voices, maybe hundreds, all calling out in greeting as if we were old friends they hadn't seen in years. Each voice had probably once belonged to a hiker or camper who had made the same mistake we had, who had followed mysterious directions to a clearing that didn't appear on any map. The thing that looked like Jessica emerged from the tree line, followed by others. Some looked almost human, like Jessica did, wearing the faces of people they had once been. Others had begun to show their true nature: elongated limbs, too many joints, skin that hung in loose folds as if it no longer fit properly. Their eyes all had that same silvery reflection, and their movements had that same unnatural fluidity. "Welcome home," they said in unison, their voices creating a harmony that was beautiful and terrible. "Welcome to where you've always belonged." I grabbed Amanda's hand and ran again, but there was nowhere to go. Every path we took led back to the same clearing, the same bone tree, the same circle of abandoned gear. The forest had become a trap, a maze with no exit, and we were rats running through passages that only led deeper into the dark. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs gave out, finally collapsing against the trunk of a massive pine tree. The chorus of voices had grown quiet, but I could still feel them watching us from the shadows, patient as only predators could be. "What do they want?" Amanda gasped, clutching at her chest as she struggled to breathe. "I think they want us to become like them," I said, remembering the way Jessica had looked when she'd returned. Empty, hollow, like a shell being worn by something else. "I think they collect people, add them to their family." "There has to be a way out," Amanda insisted. "People don't just disappear without a trace. Someone would come looking for us." But even as she said it, I realized how wrong she was. We had told no one exactly where we were going, had followed directions that led to a place that didn't officially exist. The park rangers would have no idea where to even begin searching for us. A new sound reached our ears, the rumble of an engine somewhere in the distance. Amanda and I looked at each other with sudden hope. "A truck," she whispered. "Someone else is out here." We climbed to our feet and began running toward the sound, crashing through underbrush and leaping over fallen logs with renewed energy. The engine noise grew louder, and through the trees ahead I could see movement. A pickup truck driving slowly along what looked like a legitimate Forest Service road. "Help!" Amanda screamed, waving her arms above her head. "Help us!" The truck stopped and a man in a ranger's uniform got out. He was middle-aged with graying hair and kind eyes, exactly the sort of person you'd want to encounter in an emergency. "Ladies, what are you doing out here?" he called, walking toward us. "This area is restricted. No camping allowed." "Thank God you found us," Amanda sobbed, rushing toward him. "Our friend disappeared, and we got lost, and there are things in the woods." "Slow down," the ranger said gently, holding up his hands. "Let's start from the beginning. What's your friend's name?" "Jessica," I said, hanging back slightly. Something about this felt too convenient, too perfectly timed. "Jessica Williams. She disappeared from our campsite last night." The ranger nodded sympathetically. "I see. And where exactly were you camping?" "In a clearing about a mile from here," Amanda said. "We followed some directions Jessica found online." "Online directions," the ranger repeated, and I noticed that his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "To an unofficial camping area." "Yes, that's right. Can you help us find her?" The ranger's smile grew wider, showing teeth that were just slightly too sharp. "Oh, I know exactly where your friend is. She's been waiting for you." He reached up to tip his hat, and as his sleeve fell back I saw that his arm was covered in the same dark veins I'd noticed on Jessica's face. His skin had that same waxy quality, and when he breathed, I caught a whiff of that familiar rotting smell. "Amanda, run," I whispered, backing away from the false ranger. But it was too late. The woods around us erupted with movement as dozens of the creatures emerged from their hiding places among the trees. They had been surrounding us all along, herding us toward this moment, this final trap. Some wore the faces of park rangers and hikers. Others had abandoned human form entirely and skittered through the underbrush on too many legs. At the center of them all stood Jessica, or what had been Jessica, watching us with those terrible silver eyes. "Welcome home," she said, spreading her arms wide as if to embrace us. "Welcome to the family." I grabbed Amanda's hand and pulled her toward the truck, hoping against hope that the keys might still be in the ignition. But as we reached the vehicle, I saw that it was as false as everything else. The metal body was actually painted bark. The windows were sheets of some transparent substance that felt like dried skin. The creatures closed in around us, moving with that same eerie synchronization. Up close, I could see that they weren't quite as human as they appeared from a distance. Their proportions were slightly wrong, their movements too fluid, their faces expressionless masks that didn't quite fit over whatever lay beneath. "It doesn't hurt," Jessica said, reaching out to touch my face with fingers that were too long and ended in sharp points. "It's actually quite peaceful. You just go to sleep, and when you wake up, you're part of something larger than yourself." I jerked away from her touch and pulled the knife from my belt, a 4-inch blade I'd brought for cutting rope and preparing food. It seemed pathetically small against the horror surrounding us, but it was all I had. "Stay back," I warned, waving the knife in front of me. "Don't touch us." The creatures laughed, a sound like wind through dead leaves. "Steel can't hurt us here," the false ranger said. "This is our place. We make the rules." But as he spoke, I noticed something. When my knife caught a stray beam of sunlight filtering through the canopy, several of the creatures flinched slightly, as if the reflected light caused them discomfort. Light. That was why our fire wouldn't burn properly, why our flashlights had died. These things didn't just live in darkness, they needed it. They were weakened by light. I angled the blade to catch more sunlight and swept it in a wide arc. The creatures stepped back, hissing like angry cats. "Amanda," I said without taking my eyes off the circle of horrors. "My pack. There's a signal mirror in the front pocket." Amanda scrambled for my discarded backpack while I held the creatures at bay with the knife. The blade wasn't much of a weapon, but the reflected sunlight was enough to keep them from closing in. "Got it," Amanda said, pulling out the small mirror I'd packed for emergency signaling. "Angle it toward the trees," I instructed. "Find every patch of sunlight you can, and reflect it at them." Amanda caught on immediately, sweeping her mirror to catch the scattered beams of light filtering through the canopy. Where the reflected light touched them, the creatures recoiled with inhuman shrieks of pain and rage. But there wasn't enough light. The thick canopy blocked most of the sun, leaving only scattered patches that we could use as weapons. And I could see that the creatures were adapting, moving to stay in the deepest shadows, circling around to attack from our blind spots. "The tree," Amanda gasped, pointing toward the bone tree at the center of the clearing. "Look at the top." I followed her gaze and saw what she meant. The twisted tree rose high above the surrounding canopy, its upper branches reaching into direct sunlight. If we could get up there, we might have enough light to fight back effectively. "Can you climb?" I asked. "I was on the rock climbing team in college," Amanda replied grimly. "I think I remember how." We made a run for the tree, using our mirrors to clear a path through the hissing, writhing mass of creatures. The bone tree was even more horrible up close. I could see that some of the skulls embedded in its bark still had scraps of hair and flesh clinging to them, and the smell of decay was overwhelming. But it was climbable. The bones and twisted branches provided plenty of handholds, and Amanda scrambled up the trunk with impressive speed despite her obvious terror. I followed, the knife clenched between my teeth and my mirror tucked into my belt. The creatures gathered at the base of the tree but didn't follow us up. As we climbed higher and more sunlight reached us, I understood why. They couldn't tolerate direct light. They paced in furious circles below us, their true forms becoming more apparent as their human disguises began to slip away. Jessica was the worst. Her blonde hair had fallen out in patches, revealing mottled gray skin underneath. Her clothes hung in tatters from a frame that was far too thin and tall, and her arms had elongated until her fingers nearly reached the ground. But her face was the most horrible part, still recognizably Jessica's features, but stretched and distorted like a funhouse mirror reflection. "Sarah," she called up to us, and her voice was a chorus of every person who had ever died in these woods. "Come down. Don't make this harder than it has to be." We climbed higher, finally reaching the crown of the tree where sunlight streamed through the canopy in golden shafts. Up here, surrounded by light, I felt something like hope for the first time since Jessica had disappeared. "Now what?" Amanda asked, perched on a branch beside me. "We can't stay up here forever." She was right. Already I could see the creatures working together below us, using their unnatural strength to push against the base of the tree. The ancient wood groaned ominously with each impact. "There," I said, pointing through the branches toward a distant ridge. "I can see a road, a real road with power lines." It was perhaps half a mile away through dense forest, but it represented our only hope of escape. If we could get there, if we could flag down a passing car. "We'll have to make a run for it," I said. "Use the mirrors to clear a path and then run as fast as we can." Amanda nodded, checking her grip on her mirror. "On 3. The tree shuddered beneath us as the creatures threw their weight against it again. Several of the bone ornaments fell from the branches, clattering to the ground below. "1, I said, gathering my courage. The tree tilted slightly, its ancient roots beginning to tear free from the earth. 2. Another impact, and I heard the sharp crack of breaking wood. 3. We leaped from the tree just as it began to topple, landing hard in the soft pine needles and rolling to absorb the impact. All around us, the creatures scrambled to reposition themselves, their silver eyes glowing with predatory hunger. Amanda and I stood back to back, mirrors raised, sweeping reflected sunlight in wide arcs around us. The creatures shrieked and recoiled, but there were so many of them, and they were learning to coordinate their attacks, staying just beyond the reach of our light while slowly closing the circle. "Move!" I shouted, and we ran. The forest became a nightmare gauntlet of grasping hands and snapping teeth. The creatures pursued us from every direction, leaping from tree to tree, bursting up from the forest floor, dropping from overhead branches. Our mirrors were the only things keeping them at bay, but the patches of sunlight grew fewer and farther between as we moved deeper into the woods. Amanda stumbled and nearly fell, her mirror flying from her hand to shatter against a tree trunk. Immediately, the creatures surged forward from her blind side. I swept my own mirror toward them, but there wasn't enough light to cover both of us effectively. "Take mine," I said, pressing the mirror into her hands. "Keep running. I'll hold them off." "Sarah, no. Go!" I shoved her forward and turned to face the creatures with only my knife. They were beautiful and terrible in their true forms, elongated figures that seemed to be made of shadow and starlight, with too many joints and faces that shifted like reflections in dark water. They moved like dancers, flowing around and over obstacles with liquid grace. The thing that had been Jessica reached me first, her distorted features twisted into what might have been sadness. "Why are you fighting us?" she asked in that horrible chorus of voices. "We're offering you immortality. You'll never be alone again. You'll never hurt again." "Because you're not really offering," I said, raising my knife. "You're taking. You're stealing people's lives and wearing them like masks. Is that so wrong?" She tilted her head, and I could see other faces beneath her features, the faces of all the people this thing had consumed over the years. "Look at what we preserve. Look at what we save from death and decay." She gestured toward the other creatures, and I could see it now. The ghost of humanity in each of them, the echoes of people who had once been loved, who had once had dreams and fears and hopes. All of it trapped forever in these twisted forms, neither truly alive nor truly dead. "Let them go," I said. "Let them rest." "We can't," Jessica replied, and for a moment her voice was her own again, filled with desperate longing. "We don't know how. This is all we are now. This is all any of us remember how to be." The others closed in around me, and I knew this was the end. But instead of despair, I felt a strange kind of peace. At least Amanda might escape. At least someone would survive to tell the world what had happened here. Then I heard the roar of an engine. Not the false truck from before, but the real sound of a powerful motor cutting through the forest silence. Bright lights blazed through the trees, genuine LED beams that sent the creatures scattering with shrieks of pain. A massive ATV burst into the clearing, driven by a man in actual park ranger gear. Behind him on the vehicle, Amanda clung to a light bar that blazed with enough illumination to turn night into day. "Get on!" Amanda screamed, extending her hand toward me. I ran, dodging between the retreating creatures and leaping onto the back of the ATV just as the ranger gunned the engine. We tore through the forest, the light bar carving a path through the darkness and sending our pursuers fleeing deeper into the shadows. Behind us, I could hear them calling our names one last time, not with hunger now, but with something that sounded almost like grief. We didn't stop until we reached the main road, where the ranger finally cut the engine, and we all sat in stunned silence for several minutes. "Real park ranger," Amanda finally said, patting the man's shoulder. "I checked his ID and everything." The ranger, whose name tag read Morrison, turned to look at us with concerned eyes. "I've been patrolling these woods for 15 years, he said. "I've seen things, heard stories, but I've never seen anything like what was chasing you." "You believe us?" I asked. He nodded grimly. "There have been disappearances over the years, people who went into the deep woods and never came out. The official explanation is always bears or getting lost, but—" He shrugged. "I've always suspected there was more to it." "What happens now?" Amanda asked. "Now I call this in," Morrison said, reaching for his radio. "We'll get a search and rescue team out here, try to find any trace of your friend." But I knew they wouldn't find anything. The forest would show them exactly what it wanted them to see. Nothing. Jessica would become another statistic, another hiker who simply vanished without a trace. The search lasted 3 days. They found our campsite exactly where we'd left it, complete with Jessica's torn tent and the mysterious bloodstains. But they found no body, no trail, no sign of where she might have gone. The official report listed her as missing, presumed dead due to animal attack. Amanda and I never told anyone the real story. Who would believe us? We barely believed it ourselves, except for the nightmares that haunted us both for months afterward. Dreams of silver eyes watching from the darkness, of voices calling our names from empty forests, of Jessica begging us to come back and join her forever. Sometimes I wonder if we should have stayed, if we should have let them take us too, so that Jessica wouldn't be alone in that horrible communion of lost souls. But then I remember the desperation in her voice when she tried to convince us to join them, and I know we made the right choice. The thing wearing Jessica's face was no longer my friend. My friend was gone, consumed by something ancient and hungry that had been waiting in those woods long before the first humans ever walked through them. Something that would keep waiting, keep collecting, until someone found a way to stop it. I moved to Oregon 6 months later, as far from East Texas as I could get. Amanda went back to California. We don't talk anymore. The shared trauma was too much, too heavy to carry together. But I know she thinks about it, just like I do. I know she wakes up some nights with the taste of rotting leaves in her mouth and the sound of multiple voices calling her name. And sometimes, on dark nights when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear them. Still hear Jessica and all the others calling from somewhere between the trees, begging us to come home. The big thicket is still there, still claiming hikers and campers who wander too far from the marked trails. The Park Service has posted new warning signs, established clearer boundaries, but people still disappear. They always will, as long as that thing in the woods keeps hunting. I've thought about going back sometimes, about trying to find some way to put those trapped souls to rest. But I know I'd never make it out alive a second time. The creatures would be waiting for me, and they would be much hungrier than before. So I stay away, and I try to forget, and I tell myself that some mysteries are better left unsolved. But late at night, when sleep won't come, and the darkness feels too heavy, I remember Jessica's true voice breaking through the chorus one last time, and I know that somewhere in those ancient woods my friend is still trapped, still calling for help that will never come. The trees remember everything, you see, and they never let go.